Have you ever held a photograph so long that the face in it began to feel less like a record of a moment and more like a window into one? Not a metaphor? Not the way people say that a photograph captured something, meaning only that it is vivid or well composed, that the light is doing something interesting in the background. The literal sense of it, the sense that if you reached through the paper, you might feel something on the other side. That the light in the photograph is not light that was caught and then fixed, but light that is still going, still moving, still illuminating something on the other side of the frame that you cannot see from where you are standing. Have you ever looked at a photograph of someone and had the sudden bodily sense that the person in the photograph was more present than the person you had been speaking to that morning? That something essential had gone into the image when it was taken and had not come all the way back out? That the photograph had more of them than the daily world did, and it was not giving it back? Most of us feel this once or twice in a life. We do not talk about it much because it does not have a good name, and because it sounds, when you try to put it into words, like you are describing a feeling about feelings, which is not a thing that travels well. But the feeling is real. It is specific. And I would ask you to hold on to it tonight, because I'm going to take you somewhere that feeling stopped being a feeling and became a documented fact, a measurable, photographable, 40-year fact, sitting in a flat archival box in a county courthouse basement in the state of Tennessee, waiting for anyone patient enough to look at it properly and understand what they are seeing. There is a collection of 43 photographs in the archive of the Laurel County Historical Society in Harlan, Tennessee. The archive occupies 2 rooms in the basement of the county courthouse, and the 43 photographs in question are stored in a flat archival box, acid-free, behind a filing cabinet in the second of those rooms, and the box does not have a label on it, and it has not had a label since it arrived in the winter of 1948, donated by the estate of a man named Samuel Fenn, who was 77 years old when he died, and who had been the keeper of these photographs for the last 26 years of his life. 43 photographs, all of the same 2 faces, taken once a year, every year, for 40 years, between the summer of 1880 and the spring of 1920, the same 2 faces, 40 years. One of those faces does not change. I am going to tell you which one. I am going to tell you what the photographs look like, one by one, in the order they were taken, and I am going to tell you what is wrong with them, and what that wrongness cost the one man who understood it earliest, and what it has cost every person who has sat with these photographs long enough and quietly enough to understand it since. But I am not going to begin with the wrong thing. I am going to begin with the 2 boys, and the father who pointed the camera at them every year and made the image, and the county they lived in, and the limestone hollow about 3 miles north of the Fenn property, where a spring ran cold even in August, where the water held perfectly still no matter the weather, and where Elias Fenn went alone in the hours before dawn on the morning of April the 3rd, 1886. His 16th birthday, a Tuesday, the last morning of his old life, and he did not know it. Only one of them ever talked about that morning afterward. And what he said about it, he wrote in a journal he hid inside a false wall in the back of a cedar closet in a house that was torn down in 1952, and the journal went with the rubble, and it took 31 years and a road crew and a man named Dale Witt with a pry bar for anyone to find it. We are going to come to the journal. We are going to come to the spring. We are going to come to the morning of April the 3rd, 1886, and what Elias Fenn saw in that water, and what the water took from him in return. But not yet. First, I need to give you the boys, and the father who loved them and pointed his camera at them every April, because he did not know what else to do with the fullness of that love, and the 40 years of photographs that are waiting for us in a basement in Tennessee. The photographs will not mean what they mean unless you understand who is in them, and the wrong thing in the photographs will not land the way it lands unless you have been made to understand, before you see it, exactly what should be there instead. Settle in. Get comfortable. I have a long way to take you tonight, and I want to take you there properly. If this is the kind of case you would want 10 of, not one, there is a collection. It is called What the Photographs Keep. 9 cases, 4 states, 1870 to 1940. Link in the description. Tell me where you are watching from. Put it in the comments. And if you have not, subscribe. It is free, and it means the next one finds you. Now then, let me start with the photographs themselves, not with the people in them, not yet. The photographs first, because the photographs are the thing, the beginning and the end of it, and because before you can understand what is wrong with them, you have to understand what they are. Physically, what they feel like in your hands, what a person does when they look at them for the first time without knowing what they are supposed to look for. The box they are kept in is 12 inches by 16 inches and about 3 inches deep, and it is a standard archival box, the kind you find in every county historical society in the country. Pale gray cardboard with a hinged lid. The name on the donation record in the archive ledger is S. Fenn, 1948, Harlan County, Tennessee, and there is no other description, no content summary, no index card. Someone at some point in the last 7 decades wrote the word photographs in pencil on the inside lid, and that is the extent of what the box tells you before you open it. The archivist at Laurel County, a woman named Patricia Ely, who has worked in that basement for 16 years, told me she had opened the box maybe 4 times in all that time. She said the photographs were unusual enough that she had thought about writing something up about them, a proper finding aid, a note in the county history newsletter, something. She said she never had, and that she was glad, in retrospect, that she had not, and that when I asked her why she was glad, she paused for what I counted as about 8 seconds, and then said that some things were better documented by someone who had not spent time alone with them in a closed room. I took that as a warning. I wrote it down in the margin of my notebook, and then I spent the next 3 weeks alone with them in a closed room on 3 separate visits to Harlan between the spring of 2019 and the fall of 2020, and I understand now what she meant, and I am going to tell you what I found. The photographs are in chronological order. Someone arranged them that way before they went into the box. Presumably, Samuel Fenn himself, in the weeks before his death in January of 1948, and the order has been maintained across the decades in the archive. The earliest photographs are daguerreotypes on silvered copper plates, quarter plate size, roughly 4 1/4 by 3 1/4 inches, housed in their original small leather cases with hinged lids and velvet-lined interiors. These are the photographs from 1880 through approximately 1883. The later photographs are cabinet cards, albumen prints mounted on thick cardboard backing, the standard portrait format of the late 19th century, and these run from 1884 through approximately 1910. The final 9 photographs, from 1911 through 1920, are gelatin silver prints, more modern in their rendering of shadow and detail, mounted on plain cardboard without elaborate studio markings. Together, they make a sequence, a document of 2 lives, growing, changing, year by year, the way a family portrait series is supposed to work. The father gets this going when the boys are 10 years old, in the summer of 1880, and he keeps it up every year until he dies in 1901. After his death, Samuel takes over, hiring a photographer each April to come to the property and make the annual image until 1920, when the series stops. Not because Samuel decided to stop. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because the ending matters, and you will want to know it in the right order. The series stops in 1920 because something happens in the spring of that year, between the last week of March and the first week of April, that makes a second photograph impossible. I will tell you what happens. Not yet. There are 43 photographs in the box. There should be 41. The series runs from 1880 to 1920, 41 years, 41 Aprils, 41 instances of 2 brothers standing in the yard of the family property while a photographer arranged them and told them to hold still. But there are 43 photographs, not 41, because 2 of those years include a second image made on the same day, and the years with 2 photographs are 1892 and 1906, and the reason those specific years warranted a second image is one of the things I am going to make you wait for. Because when I tell you the reason, it will only land correctly if you understand what the photographs looked like before those 2 years, and what they looked like after. Now, the face that does not change. In the first photograph, taken in the summer of 1880, when the boys are 10 years old, both faces look 10, round, soft-jawed. The particular expressionlessness that a child produces in a formal portrait when they are trying to hold still for longer than children want to hold still, and the effort of it has pushed everything else out, both of them unmistakably 10. In the last photograph, taken in the spring of 1920, when the boys are 49 years old, one face looks 49, lined, heavy along the jaw. The eyes have gone deeper into the face the way eyes do when the skin above them has begun to lose its argument with time. The hair is mostly white. The neck has thickened. This is the face of a man who has lived a full life and is nearing the weight of it, and you can watch it accumulate across the 43 frames if you lay them out in order, the way you can watch anything age, if you have a photograph for each year of the aging. The other face looks 16. It looked 16 in 1886. It looked 16 in 1887. In 1890. In 1895. In 1902. In 1910. In 1920, 49 years old. And the face in the photograph is 16. The same bones, the same scar above the right temple, the same particular set of the eyes, the same upper lip, 16 years old in every photograph for 34 years. And if you sit with that for long enough, in a quiet room in a county courthouse basement, what Patricia Ely was warning me about begins to arrive, not all at once, slowly, through the side door of attention, the way dread arrives when it is being careful about announcing itself. I want to be honest with you about what I am working from, because I do not want you taking anything on faith that can be checked. There are 4 bodies of material. The first is the photographs themselves. 43 images, held at Laurel County Historical Society. I examined all 43 over the course of 3 visits. I have high-resolution scans of every photograph in the collection. 3 of the photographs were examined by a professional archivist and photographic conservator named Regan Muir, who spent 18 years in the photograph collection of a major metropolitan museum before moving to private practice, and whose formal assessment of what is and is not anomalous in these images I will share with you in full when we come to the relevant photographs. The second is a set of family papers held in 2 places. Some documents are with the photographs in the Laurel County Archive. Others are at the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville, donated in 1951 by the same Fenn estate that gave the photographs to Harlan. The family papers include correspondence, household accounts, tax records, and a partial run of a local newspaper called the Harlan Weekly Courier, which served the county from 1874 to 1931, and which has been incompletely digitized. Several issues bearing on this case I read on microfilm at the State Library on a gray Wednesday morning in March of 2020, in a reading room that smelled of old paper and the particular quality of institutional silence that comes from being in a room where people do careful, slow work. The third body of material is the journal. I will tell you about the journal when we get to the journal. What I want you to know right now is only that it exists, that it was found in 1979, and that finding it changed this case from a curiosity about some unusual photographs into something that has occupied the better part of my attention for the past 4 years. I am going to make you wait for the journal, the way I had to wait for it, because the journal will not make sense in isolation. You need the photographs first. You need the years. And the fourth body of material is a set of oral history recordings made by a graduate student named Harold Chafin from the University of Tennessee, who was conducting fieldwork in Harlan County in the summer of 1961, collecting material for a thesis on folk memory and community identity in isolated mountain communities. Chafin was not looking for anything supernatural. He was a sociologist who understood himself to be documenting the ordinary texture of how people in a particular community remembered their own past. What he found, in 14 hours of recorded interviews with people who had known or known of the Fenn family, was not ordinary, and his thesis committee apparently agreed, because the thesis was never finished, and the recordings went into a box in a university archive where they sat for 40 years until a student in a different department found them and had them transferred to cassette and then to digital. I have listened to all 14 hours. There is one interview in particular, approximately 90 minutes long, conducted on a July afternoon in 1961 with a woman named Vera Rooks, who was born in 1861 and was therefore 100 years old when Harold Chafin sat across from her with his reel-to-reel recorder and asked her about the Fenn family. Granny Rooks, everyone called her by then. She had been called that since before the Second World War. She was 100 years old. She had known the Fenn family for most of that century, and she had a specific and detailed and entirely unfrightened account of what had happened to Elias Fenn, and why, and what it meant, and what the person who wanted to avoid something like that would have needed to know in advance. I am going to tell you everything she said, but not yet. First, I need to give you the father. That is what I am working from. When I am guessing, I will say so. When something comes from only one of these 4 sources, I will tell you which one. When 2 sources disagree about the same event, and they do disagree twice, I will put both versions in front of you and let you sit with the disagreement the way you sit with anything that does not resolve cleanly. Harlan Fenn was born in Watauga County, North Carolina, in the spring of 1840, the third of 5 children of a man named Cobb Fenn, who ran a small grist mill on a creek called Elk Run near the town of Boone, and a woman named Ida Winkler, whose family had come into the mountains from the Virginia Piedmont sometime in the 1790s and had not since managed to get back out. The Fenns were not a particularly remarkable family by the standards of the mountain South in the mid-19th century. They were Baptist, self-sufficient, literate enough to keep accounts, and largely uninterested in anything that happened more than 50 miles from the mill. The children grew up knowing their hills and their seasons and the practical weight of a day's work, and most of them stayed. Harlan was the exception, not in any dramatic or rebellious way, not the kind of exception that makes a scene about leaving, the quiet kind, which is in some ways more persistent than the dramatic kind because it has nothing to push against and so never exhausts itself. He was curious about the world in a way that his father and his brothers were not, and his curiosity was the kind that needed feeding constantly, and the mill and the county were not in a position to feed it. He read everything he could find, which in Watauga County in the early 1850s was not much. The Bible, several almanacs, a water-stained volume of natural history that had belonged to his grandfather, occasional newspapers when a visitor brought one through. He taught himself arithmetic past what the county school had offered, using a textbook he borrowed from a teacher and never returned, and he was not apologetic about that. When he was 17 years old, he saw an advertisement in a newspaper for a daguerreotypist in Asheville, a man named Peel, who was looking for studio help. Harlan wrote the man a letter asking if the help he needed was the kind of help an apprentice could provide. Peel did not write back for 4 months, and when he wrote back, it was to say that he did not need an apprentice, but that he might need a boy to clean the studio and prepare the chemicals and carry equipment, and that if the boy was willing to learn while he worked, he supposed there was no rule against it. Harlan Fenn walked 41 miles to Asheville to take the job. He worked for Peel for 6 years, until the spring of 1861, and by the time he left, he knew more about photographic portraiture than Peel did, and Peel was generous enough to say so. Harlan had a particular gift for the work that Peel identified early, an ability to make people be still in the way that a portrait requires, not the physical stillness of a subject holding a pose, but the interior stillness, The quality of having gone somewhere quiet inside oneself, settled down into oneself the way water settles when you stop disturbing it. He could hear the difference in a face, or see it, or sense it through some faculty that was neither quite sight nor sound, and he could, with a word or a small piece of silence placed in the right moment, move a subject from the surface stillness to the deeper kind. The photographs he made of people in that deeper stillness were notably different from the photographs most portrait studios in the region were producing. Calmer, more honest somehow about what was actually in the face, as if the camera had caught something the subject had not intended to reveal. He enlisted in a North Carolina regiment in the fall of 1861 and was wounded at Chancellorsville in the spring of 1863, a rifle ball through the right knee that left him able to walk but not to march, and he spent the remaining 2 years of the war as a clerk in a hospital in Richmond. He did not talk about those 2 years afterward. The one reference to them in any of his correspondence is in a letter to his brother, dated March of 1866, in which he says only that he learned things in Richmond that a man who wishes to do portrait photography for a living ought not to know, because they make it harder to look at a face without thinking about what is underneath it. He was 25 when the war ended. He went back to Asheville and then kept moving, the way some men do after a war, as if the body has gotten so accustomed to not stopping that it cannot easily start again. He spent 3 years going west and south, and then west again, picking up portrait work in small towns when he needed money, and moving on when the feeling of a place had worn through. He learned the mountains the way a person learns anything that requires real attention. Slowly, badly at first, and then at some unmarked point from the inside. In the summer of 1867, at the age of 27, he came to Harlan, Tennessee, and he stopped. The reason he stopped is specific, and it matters to this case in a way that will not be obvious for some time. He stopped because of the light, not the quality of the light in any technical sense he could have written on an invoice. The character of it, the way the late afternoon light came through the gap in Clinch Mountain to the west and fell on the face of Pine Mountain to the east, and what it did to the rock face in the last 2 hours before dark, a color that was between copper and the inside of a chestnut shell, and a quality of depth to it that he could not account for with any vocabulary he had developed in 20 years of thinking about light. He wrote about it in a letter to his brother, dated August of 1867, and the letter is in the Tennessee State Library, and I have read it, and the passage about the light is the most purely honest thing Harlan Fenn ever put on paper. He wrote, "There is a light here that I have not seen anywhere in 10 years of looking at light. It comes in the late afternoon through a gap in the western ridge, and it falls on the eastern face of Pine Mountain in a way I cannot describe in any terms you would understand without having seen it yourself. It is the color of copper going to honey. It does not simply illuminate the rock. It goes into it a little, or the rock sends it back changed, and what comes back to the eye has a depth to it like water that is neither clear nor opaque, that seems to have something behind it the eye cannot quite reach. I have been trying to photograph it for 11 days, and I have not succeeded to my satisfaction. I am going to stay until I succeed, or until the season changes the light past what it currently is, because the failure is more interesting to me here than success anywhere else I have been." He stayed. He kept trying to photograph that particular quality of afternoon light for the next 34 years, until he died in January of 1901, and by the accounts I have found of him, he never succeeded to his own satisfaction, and the attempt never stopped being interesting to him, not in 34 years. That is the kind of man he was. It is worth knowing about him now, before we go further, because it explains the annual photographs of the twins, which were for Harlan Fenn not simply a sentimental custom, but an experiment, an attempt to document something he could feel was true, and that he could not quite make the camera confirm. He set up a studio in Harlan in the fall of 1867, in a rented room on Main Street above a hardware store. He offered portrait services which the county had lacked in any reliable form, and he found work quickly because people who had been waiting for a photographer came to him almost immediately. He was methodical and patient, and his portraits were good in a way that people in the county could feel without entirely being able to say, and within 18 months he had enough steady business to rent a better space. He met Clara Holbrook in the winter of 1868 at a church social that he attended because he had heard from a customer that the youngest Holbrook daughter played the piano with some skill, and he had not heard the piano played well in 4 years, and he missed it in the specific way. You miss something that you did not know you depended on until it was gone. Clara Holbrook was 22 years old, the youngest of 3 daughters of a man who operated a tannery on the eastern edge of town. She did play the piano well, better than most people in the county had heard it played, and she had the quality that Harlan recognized immediately. The interior stillness, the quality of having gone somewhere quiet inside herself, except that with Clara Holbrook, it was not something she produced for a camera or for an occasion. It was simply how she was, the resting state of her face and her hands, and the way she held herself at the bench while she played. And alongside the stillness, she was opinionated and funny and pushed back on things she disagreed with in a flat, calm way that left no room for argument. The stillness was not absence. It was the stillness of a person who was very fully in any given moment without any of the agitation that full presence usually costs. Harlan sat next to her at the piano bench after she finished playing and talked to her for 40 minutes. And he understood by the end of those 40 minutes that he was going to marry her if she would have him. He courted her for 8 months. They were married in September of 1868 in the church in Harlan where Clara's family had been members for 20 years, and in the spring of 1870, on the 3rd of April, their children arrived. 2 of them. The midwife was a woman named Opal Sexton, who had been delivering babies in Harlan County for 22 years, and who wrote the times in the Fenn family Bible herself, because Harlan asked her to be exact, and she was an exact woman. 3:47 in the morning and 4:06 in the morning. 19 minutes between them. The Bible is in the Tennessee State Library, with the rest of the family papers, and I have held it, and I have read those 2 entries in Opal Sexton's careful hand on the page headed births, and the 19 minutes between them felt, holding that Bible in a climate-controlled reading room, like a much more significant gap than 19 minutes usually is. I will come back to the 19 minutes. It becomes important later in a specific and mechanical way that I am not going to explain yet, because explaining it now would spoil the shape of what happens in 1886. What I will say is this. The 19 minutes are one of 4 facts about the twins that you need to hold from the beginning, and they are the fact that took me the longest to understand. The other 3 facts are these. Elias Fenn, who arrived first at 3:47, was left-handed, not ambidextrous, not mildly preferring the left. Left-handed in the thorough, unself-conscious way that left-handed people are when nobody has made them feel wrong about it, and Harlan Fenn was a man who thought handedness was a matter of equipment rather than morality, and did not try to correct it. Elias wrote with his left hand, ate with his left hand, threw with his left hand, and reached for things with his left hand first, and this was simply true, the way his eye color was true, unremarkable unless you were paying close attention, and then visible in everything he did. Samuel, who arrived second at 4:06, was right-handed. That is fact 1. Fact 2 is a scar. When Elias was 8 years old, in the spring of 1878, he fell from the fence rail behind the barn and opened his right temple on the corner of the water trough. Harlan closed it himself with a curved needle and cotton thread, 6 stitches, and the scar healed into a line about an inch long, running from just above the right eyebrow upward and outward toward the temple. It faded over years, from red to pink to white, but it never disappeared entirely. It is visible in the photographs from 1880 onward. In every photograph where Elias is present, a small pale irregularity in the skin above the right eyebrow. Look for it. You will not be able to stop looking for it once you know it is there. Fact 3 is the smaller one, and the hardest to describe, and the one I wish I could show you directly, rather than having to put into words. Elias Fenn, when he was thinking about something, would bite the thumbnail of his left hand. Not chew it nervously, not worry at it. A single deliberate bite, upper tooth against nail, held for a moment, released. He did not appear to be aware he was doing it. His mother mentioned it in a letter. His brother mentions it in the journal, which we will come to, several times, always in passing. The way you mention something that is so constant and so particular to a person that it becomes a way of recognizing them across a room. Samuel writes, more than once in that journal, that he could tell from a distance when Elias was working through a problem, because he would see the left hand come up to his brother's mouth. Those are the 4 facts. The 19 minutes, the left hand, the scar above the right temple, the thumbnail when thinking. Hold them. They are going to matter in the way that small specific facts always matter in a case like this one, which is to say that they are going to become the measure of something. Now let me give you Clara more fully, because Clara deserves more than I have given her so far, and because what I am about to tell you about her is going to change what the photographs mean. Clara Holbrook Fenn was a contained woman, but not a closed one. The containment was more like the quality she had at the piano and in her face, a complete presence that did not leak at the edges. She knew things, and she held them the way she held notes when she played, fully, without pressure, until it was time to let them go. The quality of the things she held was evident to anyone who spent time with her, even when the content of those things was not. She had a way of listening to a person speak that made the person feel that what they were saying was reaching somewhere real, not simply being filed away, and people told her things they had not intended to tell, and often did not regret it afterward. She had 2 habits that I want to give you now, because they are going to matter later, and giving them to you now, while they are only ordinary, is the right way to do it. The first, Clara Fenn sang when she cooked, not songs with beginnings and endings. She would start a hymn and hold the first verse, and then the second verse would begin to lose its words, and she would hum the tune, and then the tune itself would drift from the hymn into something that was no longer any particular song at all, just a humming that kept something of the hymn rhythm, but went somewhere else with it. And she was not aware she was doing this, and if you asked her afterward what she had been singing, she would look puzzled and say she supposed she had just been singing, and not say what. It was the sound of her at work, the sound of her being content in a task. The second, Clara called her sons "my heart," not as an unusual endearment, not as something self-conscious. Simply, whenever she was being affectionate, whenever she wanted one of them to come to her or wanted to reassure them, she said, "my heart," in the tone another woman might use a name. "Come here, my heart. It is all right, my heart." She said it to both of them, from the time they were born until the last year of her life. It was not her word for one son or the other. It was her word for both of them together, as if they were a single thing that happened to have 2 bodies, and the word expressed that thing correctly in a way that using either of their names alone would not have done. Hold on to those. The singing that drifted from him to somewhere unnamed, the word she used for both of them together. They will come back. Clara Holbrook Fenn died in the spring of 1912 at the age of 66 of a lung infection that had been coming for most of the previous winter. She died in the house at the Fenn property at Swanner Fork, in the room she had shared with Harlan until his death 11 years earlier, with Samuel at her bedside. Elias was not present at her death. The reason Elias was not present is something Samuel writes about in the journal directly, once in the spring of 1912, and the entry is one of the shortest in the 61-year run of the journal, and it is, in its brevity, one of the most difficult to read. I will give it to you when we get there. Now let me give you the county, because the county is not a backdrop in this case. The county is the whole of it. Laurel County, Tennessee sits in the far southeastern corner of the state, in that part of the Appalachian Range that folds into the Cumberland Plateau, where the ridges run northeast to southwest in long parallel corrugations, and the valleys between them are narrow enough that in the summer you can stand at the bottom and not see the sun until 9 or 10 in the morning. The county was formally organized in 1818, though people had been living in the hollows for 30 or 40 years before that, and the town of Harlan, which served as the county seat, held about 2,400 people in the census of 1880. The county as a whole held closer to 7,000, spread across the valleys and hollows in the pattern that happens when families go out from a center over several generations, and each generation settles the next hollow in. It was becoming coal country in 1880, or beginning to understand that it was becoming coal country, because the seams had been known for decades and there was small-scale local mining, but the railroad had not yet arrived in Laurel County. And without a railroad, the coal could not move in any quantity. And without the coal moving, the economy was still the older economy. Timber, farming, the trades, the small professional services that a county seat requires. The railroad arrived in 1893, and the county changed after that in ways that the Fenn family papers document obliquely, mostly through the increasing business that Harlan's studio saw as new people arrived, and then through various references to the noise and the commerce of a different kind of town growing up around the familiar one. But in 1880, when the first of the annual photographs is taken, Harlan is still a town that knows most of its own people by name and by family, and Laurel County is still a county where the old families have lived long enough in their hollows that they know the land the way you know a person you have lived with for a long time. Not as a thing outside yourself, but as something that has become part of how you move and what you expect. The Fenn property sat on a bench of ground at the head of a hollow called Swanner Fork, about 1.5 miles from the edge of town, with Pine Mountain rising behind it to the north and the hollow dropping away to the south toward Martin's Fork Creek. Harlan had bought the property in 1867 before he met Clara, for the same reason he had come to Harlan in the first place. The afternoon light on the north face of the house fell in a particular way that he valued for outdoor portrait work, and the clearing in front of the house was level enough and open enough to give him the kind of space he had been wanting. The house was a 4-room log structure that had been there since the 1830s, with a frame addition added in the 1850s, and Harlan added a second addition in 1871, after the twins were born, which gave the house 6 rooms and a separate space off the back for his studio equipment and darkroom. The property was 14 acres, of which about 3 were cleared pasture, and the rest was mixed hardwood forest climbing the lower slopes of Pine Mountain to the north. There was a path that went north from the clearing, through the pasture and into the trees, that followed a small creek up the slope for about 2 miles before the hollow narrowed, and the path got harder and then easier again as it came out onto a limestone bench higher on the mountain. The Fenn boys knew that path from the time they could walk. They used it for everything: gathering, hunting, the kind of aimless mountain wandering that is one of the compensations for growing up in a place with few other compensations. They knew every yard of it by feel, by the quality of the soil underfoot and the way the light changed as the canopy opened and closed above them. The path went past several things worth noting, and I am going to mention them in the order the boys would have encountered them going uphill. First, at about 1/4 mile, a spring-fed pool where the creek widened briefly and the water was cold even in August, and where the family drew water when the house well was low. Second, at about 3/4 of a mile, the remains of a stone foundation, all that was left of a structure that had been there before the Fenn family and before the family before them, whose origin nobody in the county could say for certain, though various people had various opinions about it. Third, at about 1.5 miles, a place where the path forked, the right fork continuing up the main hollow toward the limestone bench, and the left fork going over a low ridge into a second hollow on the east side. And at the end of the left fork, about 1/2 mile further, was the shallow. I am going to make you wait for the shallow the way I made myself wait for it. which is to say, until you have been given enough of the landscape and enough of the people to understand what it meant that Elias Fenn went there alone in the dark on his 16th birthday. But I want you to know it is there. It was always there. The Fenn boys knew about it by the time they were old enough to follow the path by themselves, because children who grow up in a place learn its geography entirely, and the shallow was part of what there was to learn. There is one more thing to tell you about the county before we come to the photographs, and it is the kind of thing that a careful researcher puts in a footnote, but that I am choosing to put here in the body of the story, because I think it belongs here. Laurel County had a particular history with the shallow and with the area around it on the limestone bench above Swanner Fork that predated any living memory when the Fenn family arrived in 1867. The county oldest families knew a set of customs related to the place, not rules that were written down or formally taught, but the kind of understood practices that persist in a community, not because anyone chose to maintain them, but because the people who failed to observe them had, over the generations, tended to go badly, and the people who observed them had tended to go better. The custom most relevant to this case was simple to say and, it turns out, not simple to observe. You did not go to the shallow on your birthday, particularly not on the morning of your birthday, particularly not in the hours before dawn, and particularly not alone. You could go other times. You could go with other people on other days, and it was only a place, a limestone hollow with a spring, cold water that did not move, mossy rock, nothing wrong with it on an ordinary day, in ordinary light. But on the morning of your birthday, in the dark before the light came up over the ridge, alone, you did not go there. And if you felt the draw to go there on that particular morning, in those particular conditions, you did not go, and you did not speak about the draw, because speaking about it was a way of letting it get further along in you before you refused it. Harlan Fenn did not know this when he arrived in 1867. He had not grown up in the county. Nobody told him. Clara Holbrook Fenn, who had been born in Harlan County and had grown up knowing it the way you know the things your mother knew without knowing you, learned them from her, knew it, or knew something near enough to it to have understood what needed to be said and when. She had absorbed it, along with the other pieces of knowledge that a mountain county carries, in the minds of the people who have lived there long enough that the knowledge has become part of the air rather than a lesson someone sat you down to teach. She never told Harlan. She would say later, in a letter that is in the Tennessee State Library and that I have read several times, that she had meant to tell him and had not, and that she thought about this every day for the rest of her life. She wrote, "I do not know whether it would have helped. I know only that I did not say it, and that saying it was the thing I had to do, and I did not do it. And that is the whole of what I have to confess." She wrote that in 1909, 39 years after the twins were born, 23 years after April the 3rd, 1886, 9 years after Harlan died without ever understanding, by her account, what had happened to his son. We are going to come back to that letter. It is one of the most important documents in this case, and it deserves the full weight of what you will know by the time we arrive at it. But we are not there yet. Now the photographs. The first photograph is dated summer of 1880. It was taken in July or August of that year, rather than on the boy's birthday in April, which is how the annual tradition ran from the second photograph onward. Harlan had been photographing the boys since they were infants, individual portraits and family groups. But this is the first of what he considered the formal annual series, and the reason it starts in the summer rather than on the April birthday is that his camera equipment had been sent out for repair that spring and did not come back until June, and by then the light in the clearing was doing the late summer thing that Harlan particularly valued for outdoor portraits. A lower angle, longer shadows, a warmth in the color that the high noon sun of midsummer did not give. The photograph shows two boys standing in the yard in front of the house. The house is visible in the background, the log portion with its two front windows, the frame addition to the right, the porch that Harlan added in 1874 with its wooden railing. The boys are standing side by side, about a foot apart, and they are wearing what are clearly their best clothes, which, in the summer of 1880, for two 10-year-old boys in Laurel County, means dark trousers, white shirts with buttoned collars, and shoes that are clearly uncomfortable in a way that both boys are making some effort to conceal. They are not quite identical. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because as you look at the photographs, as the years pass in the photographs, the difference between the two faces becomes increasingly significant, and I want you to have the seed of that difference in mind before the years start to accumulate. The boy on the left in this first photograph is Elias. He is standing with his weight slightly on his left leg, which is a habit he carries in every photograph in which he is standing, and which I noticed on my third look at the series and then could not stop noticing. His right foot turns inward very slightly, just enough to be visible if you are looking. His left hand is at his side, but not entirely at his side. There is a slight upward curl to the fingers, as if they are thinking about coming up, that gives away the left-handedness even in a still image. His face is rounder than his brother's. The jaw has not yet found its adult shape. The eyes are set wide. The scar above his right temple is there, visible once you know to look for it, a pale irregularity in the skin above the right eyebrow that catches the light slightly differently than the surrounding skin. The boy on the right is Samuel. He is standing squarely, weight even, feet parallel. His face is slightly narrower than Elias's. The eyes are the same shape, but sit differently in the face, a little closer together, with a quality in their expression that is slightly more reserved, slightly more interior. He is looking directly at the camera. Elias, in this first photograph, is looking just slightly to the left of the camera, the way children sometimes do when they are thinking about something else entirely, while trying to comply with an adult's request to hold still. They look 10 years old. They look like boys at the absolute end of childhood, in that last brief round-faced period before the face begins to lengthen and the jaw begins to set, and they look, despite the slight differences I have described, very much like two versions of the same person. If you showed someone only the faces and covered the bodies, they would say twins without hesitation. That is the first photograph. The second photograph is from April of 1881, the boy's 11th birthday. Harlan began the practice of taking the annual portrait on the birthday starting with this one, and he kept it that way for the rest of his life. April the 3rd. Every year. The note in his studio accounts for, every year, from 1881 onward, reads simply, Annual Portrait, April, Boys, and the date. In the 1881 photograph, the boys are showing the first evidence of growth. Elias' jaw has lengthened very slightly. Samuel has picked up half an inch in height that Elias has not yet found, though they will be the same height by the time they are 14. The clothes are similar to the previous photograph. The posture is the same. Elias on the left, with the weight on the left leg, Samuel on the right, standing squarely. The year between the photographs has done what a year does to an 11-year-old boy, and nothing more. Both faces are still round in the way of children who have not yet turned the corner into adolescence. The third photograph, 1882, April the 3rd, 12 years old. Elias's face has begun the early stages of lengthening. The jaw is visibly more defined than in the previous image. The eyes have deepened slightly in the face. The roundness of childhood is draining out the way it does when a boy is 12, and the face is beginning to figure out what it will become. Samuel shows the same changes, with the slight difference in jaw width and eye spacing that distinguishes the two faces at every stage of the series. This is one of the daguerreotype photographs, and it has the particular silver-gray depth that good daguerreotypes achieve, a tonality that albumen prints on paper do not quite replicate, and the faces in it are rendered with a precision that allows you to see, already, the men these boys are becoming. The fourth photograph, 1883, April the 3rd, 13 years old, also a daguerreotype. The light in this photograph is coming from slightly to the right of where it usually comes from, which suggests either that the camera was positioned differently or that there was cloud cover that day and the light was finding its way in at an angle. The result is a slightly more dramatic rendering of the faces, with shadows that define the bone structure more clearly than in the previous images. And looking at this photograph, you can see, for the first time in the series, something in both faces that will become more pronounced as the years pass. A quality of seriousness, of having absorbed something that was not quite there at 10 or 11 or 12. They are becoming themselves. The faces are becoming distinct enough that a careful viewer could distinguish one from the other without the clue of the posture or the handedness. The fifth photograph, 1884, April the 3rd, 14 years old. This is the first of the cabinet cards, and the change in format gives a slightly different character to the image, crisper in its rendering of detail, slightly flatter in its handling of shadow. The boys are wearing similar but not identical clothes for the first time in the series, which suggests that the family's circumstances have improved enough that each can have his own wardrobe, or that the boys themselves have begun to develop different preferences about what they wear. Elias's shirt is plain. Samuel's has a narrow stripe. Both boys have grown visibly in the past year, and the faces have continued their movement toward what they will be as adults. The scar above Elias's right temple is very clear in this photograph. The light catches it at just the right angle to define the raised edge of the scar tissue against the smooth skin around it, a white line about 3/4 of an inch long, running upward and outward from the eyebrow. And here is the first of the things I am going to ask you to hold without explanation for a while. In the 1884 photograph, something about Elias's quality of stillness is different from all the previous photographs. He is standing in the same posture. His right foot is still turning slightly inward, but the quality of his stillness in this image is different. In the first 4 photographs, his stillness is a 10-year-old's stillness, an 11-year-old's, a 12-year-old's, a 13-year-old's, the stillness of a person complying with a camera, holding a position he has been instructed to hold, with the effort faintly visible. In the 1884 photograph, the stillness is different. It is the stillness that Harlan Fenn had spent his entire working life looking for in his portrait subjects. The interior kind. The kind that does not feel like compliance with anything. 14 years old, and something in Elias Fenn had gone somewhere quiet inside itself that it had not gone before. I do not know what happened in Elias's 14th year that produced this change. The family papers do not say, and the journal begins in the summer of 1886 and does not look back to cover the years before. But the change in the 1884 photograph is real, and Regan Muir, the conservator I asked to look at several of the photographs, noticed it without my pointing it out, and described it in her assessment notes as a notable increase in subject presence between the 1883 and 1884 images, which she said she could not account for by any change in the photographic technique or the quality of the light. She noted it and moved on, the way conservators do when they find something interesting that is not their job to explain. I noted it and did not move on, because I have a different job. The 6th photograph, 1885, April the 3rd, 15 years old. This is the last normal photograph in the series. I am going to say that again, plainly, because I want you to understand it before we arrive at the 1886 photograph. The 1885 photograph is the last photograph in the collection in which both faces are doing what faces are supposed to do, which is to carry the time that has passed on them like a record, show it the way a tree shows its years in the grain. The last photograph in which both faces look the age they are. 15 years old, both of them. You can see it clearly. The jaw has set more. The eyes are more defined, more adult, the layer of childhood softness almost entirely gone. These are nearly the faces of men. They are not quite men yet, but they are on the near side of it, and you can feel in the photograph the pressure of the crossing the way a 15-year-old's face is always under some kind of pressure from the direction of its own future. Both faces. 15. The last time the series shows that, in the morning of April the 3rd, 1886, at some point between 2 o'clock and sunrise, Elias Fenn got up from his bed in the room he shared with Samuel, put on his boots and his coat without lighting a lamp, and went out through the kitchen door into the dark. He went up the path, and I am going to stop there for now and tell you about the 1886 photograph, and then about the photographs that follow it, year after year after year, because the morning at the Shallow will only mean what it means after you have watched what it did to those photographs. You need to see the evidence before you can receive the explanation of it. That is simply how it works. The 1886 photograph is dated, in Harlan Fenn's own hand, on the back of the mount card, April the 3rd, 1886. It was taken in the afternoon, as the annual photographs always were, in the clearing in front of the house, with the same pine tree visible in the upper left corner of the frame that appears in every outdoor photograph in the series and that had grown, in the 6 years since the first photograph, by a noticeable amount. The boys are 16 years old. Samuel is on the right. His face shows the changes that a year brings to a 15-year-old becoming 16. The jaw has set further. The cheekbones have come in closer to the surface of the face. The eyes have taken on more of their adult depth. He is taller than in the previous photograph by what appears to be an inch or so. He is standing squarely, as always, feet parallel, weight even. His expression is the expression of a boy who has been asked to hold still for a photograph and is doing it as well as he can, which is to say, with visible patience and a certain controlled restlessness. Elias is on the left. His face is 16 years old. And I want to say that very carefully, because I am going to say the same thing about photographs from 5 years after this, and 10 years after this, and 20 years after this. And I need you to understand that when I say it about those photographs, I mean exactly the same thing I mean here. Elias's face in the 1886 photograph looks 16 years old. The jaw is where it was in the 1885 photograph, set a little further. The cheekbones are there. The adult depth in the eyes is beginning. The weight is on the left leg. The right foot turns slightly inward. The left hand has its slight upward curl. The scar above the right temple. His face looks exactly 16 years old, and it will look exactly 16 years old in every photograph for the next 34 years. Not similar to 16, not close to 16, exactly 16, as if the face arrived at 16 and then stopped arriving anywhere further. I had Regan Muir examine this photograph carefully. She looked at it for about 4 minutes under her magnifying lamp, turning it to examine the surface from different angles, and then she said that the image quality was consistent with what you would expect from a skilled photographer working with early dry plate technology in the mid-1880s in rural Tennessee. She said the mounting was correct for the period. She said the oxidation pattern on the silver in the print and the wear on the mount's edges were consistent with an image from that approximate decade. She said, in other words, that the photograph was what it appeared to be, a portrait of 2 16-year-old boys made in the spring of 1886 in Laurel County, Tennessee. And then she looked at the 1892 photograph, which I had brought in the same folder, and she did not say anything for what I counted as about 20 seconds, and then she said, in a very careful, level voice, that she would need some time with these, and could she keep them until the end of the week. I said yes. I waited until Friday. I came back. She had looked at 5 of the photographs, 1886, 1890, 1894, 1899, and 1905, the 5 that showed the largest divergence in apparent age between the 2 subjects. She had examined each one carefully by magnifying glass and by low-power microscope for any evidence of retouching, of darkroom manipulation, of double exposure, of any of the techniques that a skilled photographer might use to alter the apparent age of a subject in a print. She said she found no such evidence in any of the 5 photographs. She said the surface of each print, The pattern of silver salt distribution in the emulsions, the texture of the photographic paper, were all consistent with unmanipulated photographs. And then she said, in the same careful level voice, "I cannot explain what I am looking at." I said, "Can you say more about that?" She said, "In the photographs from 1890 onward, the individual on the left appears to be approximately 16 years of age. The individual on the right appears to be approximately 20 in the 1890 photograph, and approximately 24 in the 1894 photograph, and approximately 29 in the 1899 photograph, and approximately 35 in the 1905 photograph. In each of these photographs, the individual on the left appears to be approximately 16 years of age. The photographs are unmanipulated. I cannot explain the discrepancy. That is the conservator's formal assessment. Unmanipulated photographs showing, year after year, two men who were born on the same morning in the same room, 19 minutes apart, and one of whom appears to age in the expected way, while the other appears not to age at all. I want to make sure you understand the scale of this, because 43 photographs spread across 40 years can become, as you look at them, one after another, in a quiet archive room, almost a kind of normal. The brain finds a pattern and settles into it. And once the brain has settled into the pattern, it can begin to miss what the pattern is made of, which is that one of those two faces should not look the way it looks. One of those faces should show 34 years of living, and does not. Let me put specific photographs in front of you so the scale does not slip. The 1890 photograph. Elias and Samuel are 20 years old. Samuel's face is 20. The jaw, the skin, the slight beginning of texture around the outer corners of the eyes that men start to show in their early 20s. All there, all exactly right. You could look at Samuel in this photograph and estimate his age within 2 or 3 years without difficulty. Elias's face is 16, not 20 with a youthful appearance, not 20 passing for younger, 16. The smoothness of it is the smoothness of a 16-year-old, which is different from the smoothness of a 20-year-old in ways that are subtle but real. A 20-year-old who looks young still has the adult depth in the set of the eyes, the adult compression of the jaw. Elias's eyes in this photograph in 1890 do not have that depth. They are a 16-year-old's eyes. The 1895 photograph. Elias and Samuel are 25 years old. Samuel looks 25. His face has filled across the cheekbones in the way a man's face fills in his mid-20s, and there is the beginning of a line at the corner of his left eye, the first evidence of the 30-year-old he is becoming. Elias looks 16. The same face as the 1886 photograph. Bone for bone, shadow for shadow, the same 16-year-old face. The 1902 photograph. Elias and Samuel are 32 years old. Samuel's hair has begun to change at the temples, a first threading of gray that the photograph renders clearly. His face is a 32-year-old man's face, lived in, weathered in the particular way of men who work outside, with a kind of tiredness around the eyes that means it has been a hard decade. Elias looks 16. The 1908 photograph. Elias and Samuel are 38 years old. Samuel looks 38, or perhaps a little older, the way men sometimes age past their years when they have been carrying something difficult. The weight has come into his face, the softening under the jaw that comes with middle age, the deepening of the lines on either side of his mouth. Elias looks 16. The 1915 photograph. Elias and Samuel are 45 years old. Samuel looks older than 45. The hair is now almost entirely white. The face is the face of a man who has crossed the midpoint of his life and is past it, who has been doing hard physical work in the mountains for 30-plus years, and whose body shows it. Elias looks 16. I could go on. I will go on in a moment. But I want to pause here and tell you something about the photographs that you cannot see from my description, that you would only notice if you looked at the prints themselves in good light over several visits. In the photographs from 1886 through 1890, Elias is looking slightly to the left of the camera, the same slight left-of-center look he had in every photograph from the first one in the summer of 1880, a degree or two off the center of the lens. Not significant enough to look like a deliberate choice, just enough to suggest that his attention is somewhere slightly off to the side of whatever is in front of him. In the 1891 photograph, Elias is looking directly into the lens. And in every photograph from 1891 onward, he is looking directly into the lens, not slightly to the side, not almost directly, with the same expression in every photograph. Not a posed expression, not the artificial stillness of a subject performing composure for a camera, the interior kind, the Harlan Fenn kind of stillness, the kind his father had spent his entire working life trying to find in the faces of his portrait subjects, and that his father could produce in those subjects only occasionally, for brief windows in the long process of a portrait sitting. In every photograph from 1891 onward, Elias Fenn is looking directly into the camera with the most perfectly interior stillness I have ever seen in a photographic portrait, and his face is 16 years old. I sat with the 1891 photograph for a long time on my third visit to the Laurel County Archive on a Thursday afternoon in the fall of 2020 in a room with a buzzing overhead light and a table that had seen better decades, and I can tell you that there is something about looking at a 16-year-old face looking directly into a camera from a photograph made in 1891. That is not the same experience as looking at any other thing. I have looked at in 4 years of this case, and I am not going to try to describe it more precisely than that, because I think the description would run past the experience, and the experience is enough. I need to tell you now about the second photograph from 1892, because that is the first of the 2 years in the series with 2 photographs, and the second image from that year is the one with the writing on the back. There are 2 words written on the back of the second 1892 photograph, in Samuel Fenn's hand, in pencil, in letters that are very small and very careful, as if they were written slowly and deliberately, and with a clear understanding that they might someday be read. I am going to tell you what the 2 words are, and then I am going to tell you why they are there, and what caused them to be written, and what Samuel Fenn understood in 1892 that he had not understood before. But first I have to tell you about the year before that, and the year before that, and how Harlan Fenn responded to what he was seeing in his photographs, and what Clara Fenn was doing in those years in the same house, watching the same face. The 2 words are, still here. That is all. Still here. On the back of a photograph of his twin brother, who is 22 years old and looks 16, still here. Hold those 2 words. We are going to come back to them. Harlan Fenn took the annual photograph in April of 1886 and developed it in his studio and looked at it for a long time and thought, for reasons he could not articulate even to himself, that something about the image of Elias was not right. He printed a second version of it, adjusting the exposure, and looked at that and thought the same thing. He wrote about this in a letter to his brother James in Watauga County, dated May of 1886, which is in the Tennessee State Library, and the relevant passage is short and tells you exactly what kind of man Harlan Fenn was. He wrote, "I have been looking at the annual photograph of the boys for 2 weeks now, and I cannot say what is wrong with it. The image of Samuel is correct. The image of Elias does not look like Elias. I cannot say what it looks like instead. I have made 2 prints, and they are both the same. I am going to try again next year and see whether the difficulty repeats. Not like Elias. He cannot say what it looks like instead. He does not write that it looks like a younger Elias, because in April of 1886, Elias is 16 and looks 16, and there is nothing in the photograph itself that announces this as wrong. The wrongness is something Harlan felt without being able to name, which is the worst kind of wrongness, because it does not give you anything to fix and nothing to argue with. He tried again the next year. The 1887 photograph shows Elias and Samuel at 17 years old, except that Elias does not look 17, he looks 16. He looks exactly as he looked in the 1886 photograph. And Harlan Fenn developed that photograph and looked at it for a long time and then put it in a drawer in the studio and did not look at it again for 3 months, according to a note in his studio accounts that says, simply, "Re the April photograph. Not ready. Dated July of 1887. Not ready. Not ready to discuss it, not ready to look at it again, not ready to do whatever the next thing was. 3 months of not being ready, and then the drawer stayed locked. And in April of 1888, he took the photograph again, and 1889, and 1890, and every year until he died, and the note in his studio accounts for every year after 1887 reads the same. Re the April photograph, filed. Just filed, a word that means he had looked at it and put it away. He never discussed it. Not with Clara, not with the boys, not with his customers or his colleagues or his brother, beyond that one letter in 1886. He kept taking the photographs and filing them in the drawer, and the drawer was locked, and he carried whatever he understood or almost understood about those photographs with him for the rest of his life. And then he died, and the drawer passed to Samuel. I spent a long time thinking about that silence. 14 years of annual photographs, 14 locked drawers, 14 entries in the accounts that say filed, and nothing more. A man who could see that something was wrong, and who never said so out loud. There are different ways to read that silence. It could be fear. It could be the way a practical man sometimes refuses to engage with something that falls outside what he knows how to engage with, that refuses to become a category he can use his skills on. It could be love. The love of a father who does not want to say out loud what he can see in his son's face, because saying it would make it real in a way that not saying it does not. I think it is probably all three, and I think the weight of it is in the studio accounts, in those 14 entries that say nothing except that he had filed the thing away. That is the record of a man managing something by not looking at it, which works for a certain number of years and then stops working, and I do not know when it stopped working for Harlan Fenn, because he died before I could find out. He died in January of 1901, at the age of 60, of heart failure, in the house at Swanner Fork with Clara and both boys present. He was 60 years old, and he had been healthy, as far as the family papers say, until the autumn of 1900, and the death in January seems to have been fast. The death certificate in the county records says only heart failure, and the date, and there is no description of a prolonged illness. The studio accounts for the last months of 1900 show no reduction in work, no indication that he was slowing down. He simply died in January, in the house where he had lived for 34 years, and the locked drawer in the studio passed to Samuel, along with everything else. Samuel's journal entry for the week of Harlan's death is one of the few places in the 61-year run where the journal breaks its observational tone and allows something more directly felt. The entry for January the 22nd, 1901, reads, "Father died this morning at about 3 o'clock. He was 60 years old. He was a good man and a better photographer than anyone in the county understood while he was alive. And I think he knew things about light and about faces that he never quite managed to put into words, and that is a loss of a particular kind. I am glad he is not troubled any more. I did not know until today how much of the trouble I could see in his face in the last years. I thought it was age. I think now it was the photographs. I think it was the photographs." Samuel's own words, 1901. He knew. He had known, or had been approaching knowing, for some time. And on the day his father died, with the particular clarity that grief sometimes brings, he wrote it down plainly. He thought it was the photographs. Now let me give you the letter. Clara Holbrook. Fenn's letter to James Fenn in Watauga County is dated March the 15th, 1909. It is 3 pages long, written on cream-colored stationery in the careful upright hand that Clara used for all her letters in that period. Most of the letter is ordinary: family news, the condition of the property, Samuel's progress on repairs to the barn, the unusually warm February they had been having. And then, on the second page, in the middle of a paragraph that had been discussing the farm accounts, she makes a turn. She makes it without preamble, without any transition sentence, the way a person makes a turn when they have been building toward it for a long time and have finally used up all the reasons not to. She writes, "I have been meaning to write to you about Elias for some time now, James, and I have found, each time I sat down to do it, that I do not know how to begin. I am going to try now, and I am going to be brief, because the more I write about it, the less I will actually say." She writes, "You know that the photographs Harlan took every year show Elias younger than he is. I know you know this because Harlan told you in his letter of 1886, and I know he told you because after Harlan died, I read all the letters he kept, and yours was among them. What you do not know, James, and what I am telling you now, is that the photographs are not wrong. They are showing what is there." She writes, "I do not know what to do with this. I have not known what to do with this for 23 years, and I will not know what to do with it for however many years I have left, which the doctor tells me is not many. I am telling you now because I will not leave this world without having said it plainly to someone who is far enough away from it to hear it without breaking." She writes, "I did not tell Harlan. I should have told Harlan. I knew what place Elias had gone to that morning, because the year before he went, I had seen him on the path above the house in the early dark, going in the direction of the upper hollow, and when I asked him about it afterward, he said only that he liked to walk in the morning before the light came up, and I believed him, and I should not have believed him, because I knew what the draw to that place meant, and I should have said so out loud, and I did not." She writes, "Elias is still here. He is 39 years old, and he is well to look at and to speak to, and he works the farm with Samuel, and he is kind and quiet and present in every ordinary way. And his face has been 16 years old for 23 years. And I am his mother, and I have looked at that face every day for 23 years, and I can tell you that I do not know what is looking back at me out of it. Not always. Most of the time I know my son. But there are moments, in certain lights, when he looks at me with that face, and I feel that what is looking back at me is not a 39-year-old man's knowledge inside a boy's face, but something older than either of those things, and I cannot say more than that." She writes, "I want you to know that I could have stopped it. That is the thing I need you to know, James. I could have stopped it, and I did not. And the reason I did not was that I did not say the thing I knew out loud, because I was afraid that saying it out loud would make it real in a way that not saying it did not. And that was foolish, and it was cowardly, and Elias has been paying for it for 23 years. And then she goes back to the farm accounts. 3 more sentences about the barn repairs and a closing. That is all. 3 pages, 1 paragraph of which changes the shape of everything, and then back to the barn. She died 3 years after writing it. She did not write to James Fenn again. The farm accounts for the 3 years between the letter and her death are in the Tennessee State Library, and they show exactly what she described in the letter. Elias, working the farm with Samuel, the property continuing, the ordinary infrastructure of a life in the mountains in the early 20th century, proceeding without comment. Except for one entry. In the account book for the spring of 1912, the final entry in Clara's hand, dated 2 weeks before she died, reads, "E. to his walk this morning, 4 in the morning. I did not go to the window. I do not know any more what I would see if I went to the window, and not knowing is better than seeing something I cannot explain. 4 in the morning. Elias's walk. Clara Fenn, 66 years old and dying, did not go to the window to see her son leave the house in the dark." Let me stay with that entry for a moment, because I think it is the most painful thing in the Fenn family papers, and because understanding what it cost Clara Fenn to write those words depends on understanding what it would have cost her to look out the window. She was his mother. She had been watching Elias's face since it was newborn, Since it was 10 years old and round and soft-jawed in a photograph in the yard, since it was 14 and beginning to become something, since it was 16 and became something it would not leave. 23 years of watching that face. And in the last weeks of her life, she would not go to the window to watch him walk into the dark before dawn, because she did not know any more what she would see if she went. Because the face she had watched for 16 years before April of 1886 was no longer the face that was going up that path and had not been for 23 years, and she had been managing that knowledge for all of those 23 years, and she did not have the strength left to manage it in the dark of 4 in the morning in the last weeks of her life. That is the entry. 2 sentences. The whole weight of 23 years compressed into 2 sentences. She died on May the 3rd, 1912, a month after the annual photograph was taken. The annual photograph for 1912 shows Samuel at 42 years old and Elias at 16, and it is the first photograph in the series taken after Harlan's death, where the house in the background shows visible deterioration. The porch railing has a missing section, and the chimney shows some disrepair at the top. Samuel was managing the property alone by then, with Elias's help, but the house was beginning to show what it costs when there is not quite enough money and not quite enough time. Clara is not in any of the annual photographs. She is mentioned in the journal many times, always with the economy of observation that characterizes the journal throughout, and she is mentioned once more in the journal after her death in an entry dated May the 5th, 1912, which says, "Mother died 2 days ago. I am not going to write much about this. She was a good woman, and she was right about everything that mattered, and she was braver than anyone knew. The house is very quiet. It has been quiet before, but this is a different kind of quiet. Elias went up the mountain at 4 this morning. I heard him go. I did not look out the window. He did not look out the window. He used his mother's phrase. He was 42 years old, and he made his mother's choice in the days after her death, and he wrote it in the same words she had used, and whether he had read her account book entry or not I do not know, but the echo of it sits in the journal like something calling across a distance. We are going to come to the journal entries in full. But first I need to tell you about the second anomalous photograph in the series, which is from 1906, and about the woman in it, and about what the woman in it means. The 1906 photograph shows 2 men standing in the yard of the Fenn property at Swanner Fork. The man on the right is Samuel, 36 years old, and he looks 36. The man on the left is Elias, 36 years old, and he looks 16. They are standing as they have always stood. Elias on the left with the weight on the left leg, Samuel on the right standing squarely, both of them facing the camera, and between them there is a third person, a woman, standing between Samuel and Elias, slightly behind them both, with her hand resting on Samuel's arm and her face turned slightly toward Elias. She is approximately 30 years old. She is wearing a white shirtwaist with a dark collar and a dark skirt with a narrow stripe that catches the light. Her hair is pinned up in the fashion of the early 1900s. Her face is not looking at the camera. She is looking at Elias. Her name was Margaret Vestal. She was the daughter of a farmer named Emmett Vestal, who had been a neighbor of the Fenn since the 1880s, and she had married Samuel Fenn in October of 1904, when Samuel was 34 and she was 28. She is in exactly 1 photograph in the entire series. 1 photograph. In 43 photographs spanning 2 years of marriage, she appears exactly once, and she appears in that 1 photograph not looking at the camera but looking at Elias. There is no death certificate in the county records for a Margaret Vestal Fenn. The census of 1910 lists Samuel Fenn as a widower, and the word widower is the only record I can find anywhere in the documentary materials of what happened to Margaret Vestal after she married Samuel Fenn. I am going to tell you what I know about what happened to her, and I want to be clear that what I know is limited and that 2 of the 4 sources I am working from tell slightly different versions of the most important detail, and I am not going to pretend a certainty I do not have. What the journal says In entries from the spring of 1906, Margaret has begun to ask about Elias. Not directly. She asked me last week how old he was. I said we were twins, born in April of 1870. She said, "Both of you?" And I said yes. And she said nothing for a while, and then she said, in the careful way she says things when she is thinking something through, "Does he look like himself to you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "I am only asking if he looks how you expect him to look." And I said, "He looks like Elias." And then, a week later, she asked me again today, a different version of the same question. She said, "How old does Elias look to you, Samuel?" And I said, "He looks like himself." And she said, "I am not asking how he looks to himself or to you. I am asking how old he looks to me." He did not know she knew. 2 years of marriage, and she had known from before the beginning, and had not said anything, because she did not know what to say. Samuel writes, "She is braver than I am. I did not know that. I thought I was the brave one, managing it all those years. She was the brave one." The last entry that mentions Margaret is from June the 15th, 1906. Margaret has gone to stay with her sister in Bell County for a while, and I think she is not going to come back, and I think that is the right thing. And I think I knew, when I married her, that it was the most likely outcome, and I think Elias knew it too, and neither of us said so, and I am not sure there was anything to be gained from saying so. She has gone to stay with her sister. The word widower in the 1910 census. Samuel used that word, I believe, because it was the word that fit in the allotted space and required no further inquiry. He was not a widow in any technical sense, but he chose that word in his careful hand, in a column on a government form, and whatever he understood by it, he understood it fully, and he chose it on purpose. There is something in that choice that I find more heartbreaking than anything else in this case, and I have been carrying this case for 4 years. Emmett Vestal had been a neighbor of the Fenns since the early 1880s, when he took on a small farm at the foot of the next hollow to the west. He was a year or two younger than Harlan, and he had the quality that the mountains produced in that period in some men and not others. A practical intelligence that was utterly without pretension about itself, the kind of mind that can hold a complex problem and work it from the outside without ever needing to name what kind of problem it is. He had 2 children, Margaret and a son named Coy, who went to Knoxville in the late 1890s and stayed. He knew the Fenns well enough to borrow tools and have them returned, which in the mountains of that period was a measure of real trust. When Margaret left Samuel in June of 1906 and went to her sister in Bell County, Emmett Vestal said nothing about it for 3 months. Samuel's journal records seeing him at the store in town in September of that year, and the entry reads, "Emmett was at Lyle's store this morning, and he looked at me for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, 'How is your brother?' And I said he was fine, and he said, 'I thought so,' and bought his tobacco and left. I thought so." The 2 words hang in Samuel's journal, the way Margaret's name on the back of the 1906 photograph hangs in the series, present and unexplained and freighted with everything that is not said. Emmett Vestal had understood something, and he did not say what he understood to Samuel, and Samuel wrote it in the journal without comment. What Samuel does record in an entry from the spring of 1907 is what happened when Emmett Vestal went to see Vera Rooks. Samuel writes, "I heard from Jim Combs at the feed store that Emmett Vestal walked up to old Rook's place last Thursday and stayed 3 hours and came back changed. I do not know what changed means in this report. I know what I think it means, but I have been wrong before about what other people know." He has been wrong before about what other people know. That sentence in the journal is from a man who has been managing a secret for 21 years by the spring of 1907, and who has made himself wrong about how alone he was in knowing it by misunderstanding how visible the evidence was to people who had grown up with the landscape and with the local knowledge that the landscape carried. He had not understood until this moment how many people were looking. Now, let me give you the journal, because the journal is one of the 4 primary sources in this case, and because I have not yet given you its full character, and its character matters as much as its content. Samuel Fenn's journal spans 61 years, from the summer of 1886, when he was 16 years old, to the 3rd of January, 1947, when he was 76 and made his last entry. The journal is not a diary in the sense of a daily record. There are periods where he writes nothing for weeks, and periods where he writes 3 or 4 times in a week, and the distribution of those periods tells you, across 61 years, where the pressure was. The years with frequent entries are the years something was happening that required being put into words, and the long, dry stretches are the years that were simply lived. The journal is written in Samuel Fenn's hand throughout. The hand changes over 61 years, as hands do. The early entries have the slight irregularity of a young man's hand still becoming itself, and the late entries are slower and more careful, with occasional letters that do not quite close properly the way handwriting gets in old age when the grip loosens. But the voice is consistent. The way he holds a sentence, the particular economy of it, the tendency to say one thing plainly and then to let that thing carry the weight of everything he has not said alongside it. Samuel Fenn was not a literary man in the sense of having studied literature, but he had a prose writer's instinct for the weight of silence, for where to stop and let the stopped sentence work. The first entry in the journal is dated June the 8th, 1886, 2 months after the morning at the Shallow. It reads, "Father developed the April photograph this week, and I heard him in the studio for a long time looking at it. He did not say anything at supper. Mother sang while she cooked, the hymn that turns into something without a name, and Father sat very still at the table and did not eat much. I did not say anything either. Elias split firewood in the afternoon, and I watched him from the window, and his face was the same. I do not know what to write about that, so I will stop here." He does not know what to write about that, so he stops. And then he started again, 2 days later, and then again 3 days after that, and he did not stop for 61 years. Because writing about it, even in the careful, incomplete way he wrote about it, was what kept him from being entirely alone with it, and being alone with it entirely was the one thing he could not afford. What Samuel knew in June of 1886 is clear from the journal. He had been awake when Elias left the house. He writes about this in an entry from later in that first summer, looking back. "I heard him go. The boards in the hallway, the kitchen door. 4 in the morning. I knew where he was going before I heard him go, because I had felt the draw myself on the morning of our birthday 2 months earlier, the way you feel something pulling in a direction and you either follow it or you do not. I did not follow it. I did not know why I did not at the time, and I know now that the reason I did not follow it is that something in me understood, without being told, that following it alone was the wrong kind of following. And Elias went alone. I heard him go, and I did not call after him, and I did not go to the window, and I lay in the dark for 2 hours until I heard the kitchen door again and his step on the boards, and I knew he was back. And in the morning his face was the same. He lay in the dark for 2 hours. He heard his brother come back. In the morning his face was the same." Samuel understood, from the first morning in April of 1886, what had changed in the face. He understood it not as a thing that could be explained, but as a thing that was true, the way facts about the physical world are true. The sun coming over the ridge, the water in the creek running downhill, Elias's face being 16 years old, in a way it would not leave. For what it is worth, and it is worth something in this case, Samuel also writes about the birthday that followed. April the 3rd, 1887, he writes, "I felt the draw again this morning. It was less than last year, but it was there. I got up and went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark until it was past 4, and then I went back to bed. Elias was not in the room when I came back. I did not go to look for him. He was back before 6. He felt the draw every year on his birthday, for the entire run of the journal. He does not write about it every year, But when he does write about it, the phrasing is always the same. The draw, which he never defines more specifically and never needs to, because the draw is the draw, and it has only one referent in his world. He did not go. He sat in the kitchen in the dark on the morning of his birthday every year until the feeling passed. And every year, Elias went. This is the thing Samuel never says directly in the journal, but that is clear in aggregate from 61 years of entries. Elias went to the shallow every year on their birthday. Not every April, not every spring. On the birthday, before dawn, alone. Samuel would hear him go, and hear him come back, and the face that came back was always 16, and always would be. And Samuel wrote about it in the journal the way he wrote about everything, precisely, economically, without performing a feeling about it. There is one entry that is not economical. It is from April the 5th, 1892, 2 days after the twins' 22nd birthday, and it reads, "He came back this year, different in a way I cannot name. Not different in his face, which is the same it always is, not different in the way he moves or speaks, different in something behind his eyes, something that was one way last year and is another way this year, and when I look at him directly now, he looks directly back in a way he did not before, and I sat with it for 2 days before I wrote this, because I wanted to say it right, and I am not sure I have. I am going to take the April photograph to Father's studio tomorrow and look at it, and then I'm going to take another one." He took another one, the second photograph from 1892, the one with the 2 words on the back written in Samuel's careful hand after he had looked at both prints. Still here. Not still unchanged. Not still 16. Still here. Which is a different statement entirely, and one that Samuel would return to in the final years of his life, in letters he did not send, and journal entries he made, knowing they would eventually be read. Samuel Fenn never married again after Margaret Vestal left in the summer of 1906. There is one entry in the journal, from the winter of 1908, that addresses the question, obliquely and then plainly, in the way that Samuel's journal addresses everything. He writes, "Ada Truelove was at Lyle's store this morning, and we talked for a while about the cold snap and about her father's health, and she looked at me in a way that I have been aware of for some time, and that I have been trying to be careful about not looking back at in the same way, because I know what the outcome of that particular looking back would be, and I do not think I have the right to it. She is a decent woman, and she has a right to a life that is whole in the ways a life should be whole, and the difficulty is not that I do not want that for myself, because I do. The difficulty is that I do not know what to do about Elias when I try to imagine a whole life of the ordinary kind. There is no version of the sentence that contains both Elias and a wife for myself, and I have tried to write that sentence many times in this journal in different forms, and I cannot finish it. Ada is going to marry a man from Bell County and move away, I think. She should. I think she deserves to know why I am not going to look back, and I think there is no way to tell her, and so I am going to not look back. She married a man from Bell County and moved away that spring. Samuel records it in 3 words. Ada married, moved. 3 words. He had known what would happen, and he had chosen to let it happen, and then he wrote 3 words about it in the journal and went on to the next entry, which was about the condition of the north fence line. That is what it cost him. That is the scale of what it cost him. He was 38 years old. He would live to be 77. He spent those 39 remaining years on the farm at Swanner Fork, with Elias, with the photographs, with the journal, and with whatever he had not said to whoever was willing to be near him in those years. He was not a recluse. He went to town, he kept up with neighbors, he attended church in Harlan until his 60s, when the walk became too much. He was, by every account I have found, a thoughtful and decent man, who was well regarded in the county, and who kept his private life private in a way that the county, which was good at minding its own business when the situation called for it, largely respected. But he was alone in the way that a person is alone when the central fact of their life is unspeakable, when the thing that accounts for all the choices and all the absences is a thing they cannot say, and when the best they can do is write it down in a journal that they plan, eventually, to hide behind the back wall of the cedar closet in a house they know will eventually be demolished. He planned for the journal to be found. This is not speculation. The note in the photo box, which Samuel wrote and placed there himself, says, "The journal is in the cedar closet, behind the back wall, and the house is at Swanner's Fork." He told whoever found the photographs where the journal was, and he told them there was a house, and he expected the person who found the photographs to find the house and find the journal. He expected the whole shape of the evidence to eventually be assembled by someone who was not himself, and he made provision for that assembly with the same quiet practicality that he applied to everything else in his life. And then, I want to ask you something. Here, in the middle of this, because we are at the middle of this now, and I have been in this case for 4 years, and there is a question I have been carrying since the first time I sat in the archive at the Laurel County Historical Society, and Patricia Ely set the photo box in front of me and said, carefully, that I should be aware that other researchers had found it difficult to spend extended time alone with the photographs, and that I should let her know if I needed to step out. She said, "I am not saying this to be dramatic. I am saying this because it has happened, and I want you to know it before you open the box. I want to ask you, if you have a theory about what happened at the Shallow, put it in the comments now. Not what I have told you, and not what you already know, but what you think in the plain terms of what you think. We are past the photographs now and moving into the testimony, and the testimony changes the weight of the photographs, and I want to know what you are carrying before I add to it. If you are watching this with someone, this is the moment to see whether they have arrived at the same place you have. We are past the first half of this. Ahead, Granny Rooks, the March 1920 journal entries, and the last photograph. If you have a theory about what the Shallow does and why Elias came back from it different, put it in the comments now. The second half of this case is the part that kept me up at night. Harold Chafin arrived in Laurel County in June of 1961 as a graduate student from the University of Tennessee, working on a thesis about the oral history traditions of the southern Appalachian counties. He was 24 years old. He had a reel-to-reel recorder and 14 cassettes, and a funding grant from the university that covered his expenses for 6 weeks, and he had a list of 6 individuals in the county that his advisor had identified as likely sources of the kind of long-memory oral tradition his thesis was concerned with. The stories and customs and knowledge that passed in families and communities without being written down, that lived only in the minds of people who were old enough to have received them from people who were older still. Vera Rooks was on the list. She was 90 years old in 1961, or approximately 90. She was not entirely certain of her birth year, and Harold Chafin notes in his field journal that she gave him 2 different years in 2 different conversations, and that the uncertainty about the year appeared to be genuine rather than evasive, the simple uncertainty of a person who had not needed to know the year in any formal way for most of her life. She had been born in Laurel County, had lived her entire life in Laurel County, and had never been married. She lived alone in a house at the head of a hollow about 4 miles from Swanner Fork, which was already in 1961 considered remote by the standards of a county that had changed enormously in 60 years. She grew most of her food. She had a reputation in the county for knowing things, which is a way of saying several things at once that mountain communities have always found more useful than saying each of them separately. Harold Chafin visited her 4 times between June and August of 1961. The July 22nd session, which is the one I am going to draw on most heavily here, lasted 90 minutes and was the longest and most direct of the 4. He writes in his field journal that by the 3rd visit he had established enough of a working relationship with Vera Rooks that she was willing to speak about subjects she had declined to address before. He writes that the shift happened not because she trusted him more, exactly, but because she had satisfied herself that he was genuinely interested rather than merely curious, and she considered those to be different things. And she explained the difference to him directly. Curious people want the story, and then they want to be done with it and go home. Interested people want to know what to do with it. I will talk to an interested person. She told him this in the second session, and I believe it, because it is the kind of distinction that a person who has been keeping a particular kind of knowledge for a lifetime has had time to work out precisely. He asked her on July the 22nd about the Fenn family. She did not begin with the Fenn family. She began, as she had done in the previous sessions when he asked about specific subjects, with the landscape. Because for her, the landscape was not the context for the story, but the story itself, and the people in it were the evidence of what the landscape had been doing before any of them arrived and would go on doing after all of them were gone. Harold Chaffen's transcription of the session is 12 pages long, single-spaced on the university letterhead he was using as field notes paper, and I have read it many times, and the 12 pages break naturally into 3 parts: the landscape, the pool, and the people. The landscape part is about Pine Mountain and the limestone bench above Swanner Fork, and the particular history of the hollow that contained the shallow. She told Chaffin that the hollow had been known as a place of the day pool by families in the county as far back as she could trace in memory, which would put the knowledge of the place at something like the 1770s or 1780s at the earliest limit of oral transmission. She said the name, the day pool, was not the original name, that there had been names before it that she had heard once from the woman who told her, and that she had not been able to hold them because they were in a language she did not know and could not pronounce, and the sounds had not stuck the way sounds stick when you have a framework for them. She said, "There are names that belong to a place that are older than any living people, and they stay in the place even when the people who use them are gone, and sometimes you can feel them in the air of a place even when you cannot say them. That place has names like that. Daypool is only what we call it." Harold Chaffin writes in his field notes at this point that he started to ask a follow-up question, and she held up her hand in a way that he describes as the gesture of someone who has been waiting to say the next thing and does not want to lose the thread, and he stopped. She said, "The pool is a limestone sinkhole fed by a spring that goes underground before it reaches the bench. The water is cold, always cold, August cold. The surface does not move the way surface water moves. You drop something in it, and the rings go out from the center, and when they reach the edge of the pool, they come back toward the center again, and that does not happen in water that behaves like water is supposed to behave. I have seen it. I dropped a pebble in it twice, both times with other people present, and both times the rings came back. That is not something you explain with the usual explanations," Chaffin writes. I asked her whether she had gone to the pool alone. She said no. I asked her whether she had ever felt the draw to go there alone. She was quiet for what I estimate was about 15 seconds, which in a recorded interview feels very long. Then she said, "Yes, on my birthday, many years ago, and that I had felt the pull of it and sat at my kitchen table in the dark until it passed, and that I had done this on 3 birthdays before the pull stopped coming, and that I thanked God each of those mornings that I was the kind of woman who could sit at a table in the dark and wait." She had felt it too. Vera Rooks had felt the draw on her birthday, the same draw that Samuel Fenn records feeling in his journal for 61 years, the same draw that Elias Fenn followed on the morning of his 16th birthday and never stopped following. She had felt it, and she had not gone, and it had come back for 2 more years and then stopped. And she understood, from that experience, exactly what it meant that Elias Fenn had gone. Chaffin asked her to explain what the pool does, and she said, "It keeps." That is the simplest way I know to say it. It keeps what the day wants to keep. He asked what the day wants to keep. She said, "The day of your birth. Every living thing has a day of its birth, and the day of its birth is the day it comes into the running, into the counting of time, into the moving forward through years toward death. That is what it means to be born. You start running. And the day pool keeps what it can of that running from you. If you go to it on the right day, at the right hour, alone, it takes the running part. The part that is moving through years toward death. And keeps it. He asked, what happens to the person? She said, they stop running in their face. The face stays at the moment the pool found it, which is the moment of the birthday you gave it, the one you came to it on. The inside of the person keeps going. They think and feel and remember and age inside, the way any person does. They do not stop being a person, but the outside, the face that time is supposed to write on, does not change from that moment. He asked, what does the pool want with the running part? Why does it keep it? She was quiet again. Then she said, I am not the right person to answer that question. I can tell you what the pool does. I cannot tell you what it wants, because I do not know that pools want anything in the way a person wants something. I know that it keeps what comes to it, and I know that what comes to it when a person goes alone on the morning of their birthday in the dark before the light is the part of them that time would have taken anyway, and that the pool keeps it the way still water keeps anything you put in it, which is indefinitely and without judgment. He asked about the ones who went back. She said, if you go once, the pool knows your birthday. It knows your face the way it froze it. And if you go back on the right morning, on your birthday, alone, before the light, the pool finishes what it started. It takes the rest. He asked, what does that mean? She said, it means they do not come back. The person who goes back on the right morning does not come back. What happens to them, where they go, I cannot say, because no one who has gone back has ever been able to tell me, for obvious reasons. But they do not come back, and in my understanding of this, which I acknowledge is limited, going back is not the same as dying. It is something else, and I do not have a word for it, and I am suspicious of people who do. Harold Chafin wrote in his field notes at this point. She stopped and looked at the recorder for a moment. Then she said in a different register, quieter, there was a family. He said, the Fenns. She said, yes, I knew Samuel Fenn. I knew him for 60 years or more. He was a good man, and he was carrying something that would have broken most men, and it did not break him, but it changed the shape of him, the way carrying a heavy thing for a long time changes the shape of a body. You can see it if you know what to look for. He asked what she knew about Elias. She said, I saw Elias Fenn 3 times in my life. The first time I was about 20, and he was about the same age, and his face was 16. The second time I was about 40, and he was 40, and his face was 16. The third time I was about 65, and he was 65, and his face was 16, and he looked at me across the yard at the Fenn place, and he bit the thumbnail of his left hand the way Samuel once told me he had always done, and he held my eye for a moment, and I thought, you are still here, and you know it, and you are not troubled by it, and I do not know whether that makes it better or worse. Still here. The same words Samuel had written on the back of the 1892 photograph. Vera Rooks had said them independently, from her own experience of looking at Elias's face across a yard in the mid-1930s, and the words she reached for were the same ones his brother had reached for 40 years earlier, because they were the only words that were accurate. He asked her, did you ever speak to Elias directly? She said, once. At the Fenn property, in what I think was 1935 or thereabouts. Samuel was in the barn. Elias was in the yard cutting wood. I said hello, and he said hello back, and I said, how are you today? And he said, I am fine, thank you. And I said, it is a good morning, and he said, yes. And then he looked at me with those 16-year-old eyes that had 60 years of something behind them, and he said, you have felt the draw. Not a question, a statement. And I said, yes. And he said, I am glad you did not go. And then he went back to cutting wood. I am glad you did not go. 5 words. From a man whose face was 16 and who had been going to the pool on his birthday for 49 years when he said them to her across a yard in the 1930s. glad she had not gone. Not because going was wrong, but because she, specifically, Vera Rooks, who would spend the next 30 years of her life as the keeper of this particular knowledge, had been needed here, on this side of it. Chafin asked what she meant, at the end of the session, when she had talked about people carrying what the water took. She said, "When the pool takes the running part from a person, that person does not have the ordinary relation to time that the rest of us have. They do not feel time the way we feel it, which is as pressure, as urgency, as the constant sense of things being used up. Time is still moving, everywhere around them, but it is not moving through them the way it moves through us. And that makes the hours before dawn easier for them. The dark is not what it is for us, which is the dark before the light that is coming, the dark that is by definition almost over. For them, the dark is simply the dark, without the urgency of its ending. They are more comfortable in it. They move through it more easily, and so they walk in it, before dawn, before the light, not because they are hiding, because the dark before dawn is the one time of day that is the same for them as it would be if the pool had never found them." That is the end of Harold Chafin's transcription of the July 22nd session. He writes one more line in his field notes after her final word, and the line reads, "I am not going to finish this thesis, and I knew it when I drove away from her house, and I think I knew it before that, and the reason is not that I do not believe what she told me, but that I do." He did not finish the thesis. He left the university the following spring, took a job with a surveying company in East Tennessee, and lived a quiet life in Kingsport for the next 40 years. The recordings were found in a cardboard box in the storage unit of his estate in 2001, 40 years after he made them, by his daughter, who donated them to the University Special Collections Library, which is where I heard them. I heard the recording of the July 22nd session, all 90 minutes of it, twice. Once in a listening room at the University Library in February of 2019, through headphones on a digitized file, and once on a drive from Knoxville back to Harlan on my phone through the car speakers on a 2-lane road in the dark in November of 2020. The second time was the mistake. Not a mistake exactly, but the one I think about. Vera Rooks died in 1968 at the age of approximately 107. She died in the house at the head of the hollow, alone, the way she had lived. The cause of death on the certificate is listed as natural causes, age, which is the county's way of saying that a person simply stopped at the end of a very long time. She left no family, no estate to speak of, and no written record of anything she knew, because she believed, correctly, that written records were the wrong form for what she was keeping, and that the right form was what she had been doing for 100 years, which was telling the interested ones directly. Harold Chafin's recordings are the only document of what she knew. I am, as far as I have been able to determine, one of perhaps 6 people who have listened to all 14 hours of them. Now, let me go back to the photographs, because the photographs from 1907 onward carry the Granny Rooks testimony in them in a way that changes what you see when you look. The 1907 photograph, Elias and Samuel are 37 years old. Samuel looks 37, or perhaps 38. The face of a man who has been farming and carrying something heavy, and managing both with the stoic competence that the mountains required of men of his generation. There is a quality of compression in his face in this photograph that was not there in the earlier ones, a horizontal narrowing of the expression that is not grief, exactly, but is what happens to a face that has been maintaining a controlled front for a long time. Elias looks 16. And here is what I see now, looking at Elias in the photographs from 1907 onward, that I did not see on my first pass through the series. Elias is not simply unchanged. He is not a paused image of a 16-year-old boy. He is a person who has been alive for 37 years and whose interior has continued in the normal progression of a living person, and who is carrying that interior behind a face that was frozen at the moment the day pool found it. The difference, once you have Granny Rooks's testimony, between a 16-year-old face and Elias Fenn's face in 1907 is visible, or I believe it is visible. I believe what you see in his face, from the 1891 photograph onward, when he begins to look directly into the lens, is not the blankness of a 16-year-old boy, but something else, the particular quality of looking that belongs to a person who has been on the other side of something the viewer has not, who has been somewhere the viewer has not, and who understands, from that position, more about the act of being looked at than the person looking could easily guess. The 1908 photograph. Samuel has turned 40. The face is 40. The temporal divergence between the two faces in the frame is now 24 years, and it is large enough that if you did not know they were twins, if you did not know they were born on the same morning, at the same minute count apart, you might assume a generation between them. Father and son, not twins. Not two people who came out of the same room at the same hour on the same morning, 19 minutes apart. 24 years. And growing. The 1912 photograph, the year Clara died. Samuel is 42, and he looks it, and there is something in this photograph that I noticed on my 4th visit to the archive, and that Patricia Ely confirmed when I mentioned it. Samuel is standing slightly closer to Elias than he usually stands. Not dramatically closer. Perhaps 2 inches, but the photographs in the series are otherwise remarkably consistent in the distance between the two figures, consistent enough that a 2-inch change is visible when you look at the series as a series rather than as individual images. He is standing slightly closer to his brother in the year his mother died. Whether Elias moved toward Samuel or Samuel moved toward Elias, the photograph does not say, but someone moved. The 1914 photograph. Samuel is 44 years old. The Great War is about to happen on the other side of the ocean, and Laurel County will eventually send men to it and receive some of them back and not receive others, and none of this is recorded in the annual photographs because the photographs are only ever of the yard and the house and the two faces, year after year. Samuel looks 44. Elias looks 16. Samuel has developed by now a slight forward tilt to his posture, the tilt of a man whose back has been taking the weight of farm labor for decades, that he carries in every photograph from approximately 1912 onward. The 1916 photograph. Samuel is 46. The slight forward tilt is more pronounced. The hair is gray now, substantially gray, the kind of gray that comes when a man in his 40s has had a difficult decade. He looks his age, or more. Elias looks 16. And here I want to address something directly that any person looking carefully at this series of photographs from 1912 onward would eventually ask, did Elias age at all from 1886 to 1920? The photographs say no. The journal says no. The conservator's analysis says no. But there is a detail in one photograph that I am going to give you now, and that I want you to hold alongside everything else, because it complicates the simple answer. The 1918 photograph. Samuel is 48 years old. The war is over. The county has gotten back the men who were coming back, and is settling into the particular grief of a place that has sent people away and received them in pieces. Samuel looks very tired in this photograph. It is the most tired I see him look in the entire series, and in a series that spans 40 years of a hard man's life, that means something. He is standing with the slight forward tilt and the gray hair, and the face of a man at the end of a particularly difficult 2 years, and Elias is standing beside him with his 16-year-old face, and his weight on the left leg, and the scar above the right temple, and his left hand is not entirely at his side. It never is, in the photographs. The left hand has always had that slight upward curl, the ghost of the gesture that Samuel describes in the journal, the hand coming up to the left thumbnail when he is thinking about something. It is always there, in every photograph where Elias is visible and standing. But in the 1918 photograph, the left hand is a little further up than usual, not at the thumbnail, but further up than the side, as if the thinking had been going on before the photograph was taken and had not quite finished. I mentioned this to Regan Muir in our second meeting, In the winter of 2021, she looked at the 1918 photograph under the magnifying lamp for a moment, and then she said quietly, "Yes, I see that." And I said, "Does that read to you as motion?" She said, "It reads to me as intention," which is different. Intention. In a photograph of a man with a 16-year-old face, in a house in Laurel County, Tennessee, in the late autumn of 1918, a hand that reads as intention. The 1919 photograph. Samuel is 49. Both men are standing as they have always stood, in front of the house in the afternoon light. The photograph is a gelatin silver print, the format that replaced cabinet cards in the early 19-teens, and it has a different tonal quality than the earlier photographs, colder, less warm in its rendering of the outdoor light. Samuel looks 49. The house in the background shows the deterioration of a property being maintained by one man of aging with limited resources. The porch boards have a gap, and the clapboard on the frame addition needs paint. Elias looks 16. And then the last photograph. April the 3rd, 1920. The 43rd in the series, and the final one, and the one that Regan Muir examined for the longest in her assessment, and about which she said the most. That was not a technical description. It is a gelatin silver print. The boys, who are 50 years old, are standing in the yard in front of the house. The pine tree that has been visible in the upper left corner of every outdoor photograph in the series since the 1880s is now very large, larger than it has ever been, the trunk visible and thick. The afternoon light is falling from the west, as it always does in the spring photographs, and the face of Pine Mountain is visible in the upper right of the frame, the limestone of the bench showing through the trees, in the particular way it does in April before the leaves come fully in. Samuel is standing on the right. He is 50 years old, and he looks 50, or a little older. The hair is almost entirely white. The posture has the forward tilt. The face has the quality of a face that has been carrying something for 64 years and that has learned to carry it so well that the carrying no longer looks like effort from the outside. He is looking at the camera with the expression he always has in the photographs, the patient, controlled expression of a man complying with a ritual he has agreed to maintain. Elias is standing on the left. His face is 16 years old. He has the scar above the right temple, the weight on the left leg, the right foot turning slightly inward. His eyes are looking directly into the camera, as they have been since the 1891 photograph. And his left hand is at the thumbnail. Not near the thumbnail, at it. The upper tooth against the nail, the way Samuel describes it in the journal many times over 61 years. A single deliberate bite held for a moment. In a still photograph, frozen in the act, on April the 3rd, 1920, 23 days before Elias Fenn disappeared. Regan Muir's description of this element of the photograph from her written assessment reads as follows. In the 1920 print, there is a slight motion blur evident in the area of the subject's left hand, localized to the fingertips and the proximal region of the left thumb. The blur is consistent with very slow, deliberate movement during exposure. It is the only motion blur present in any of the 43 photographs in the series. I cannot account for why it appears in this photograph and no others, given that the exposure conditions in the other spring photographs appear to be comparable. I note it without being able to explain it. A slight motion blur in the left hand, the only motion blur in 43 photographs. On April the 3rd, 1920, 23 days before Elias Fenn disappeared. A hand at the thumbnail, moving in the careful, deliberate way of a person working through a problem. He was thinking about something. On the last day his photograph was taken, 3 weeks before he went up the path in the dark and did not come back, Elias Fenn was thinking about something so specifically that his left hand was moving in the exposure and left a blur in a photograph that was otherwise perfectly still. I asked Regan Muir, when I read her assessment of the motion blur, whether she had a sense of what the quality of the movement was, not what caused it, what it read as. She said, without hesitating, anticipation, not agitation, not nervousness, not distress, anticipation. The movement of a person who knows what is coming and has made peace with it and is, in the particular moment captured in the photograph, oriented toward it. 23 days. He was oriented toward it 23 days before it happened. Now I need to give you the journal entries from March of 1920, because they are the center of this case in a way that nothing else quite is, and because reading them in their sequence, knowing what follows them, is different from reading them in isolation, and the different reading is the one that matters. Samuel Fenn made 3 entries in his journal in March of 1920 that are relevant to what happened on April the 26th of that year. The first is dated March the 7th, 1920. It reads, "Elias came in from his walk this morning, later than usual. Not by much, 20 minutes, perhaps 30. I was at the kitchen table when he came in, and he sat down across from me, which he does not always do when he comes in from the walks, and we sat for a few minutes without saying anything, and then he said, 'I need you to know that I know what I am doing.' And I said, 'I know you know.' And he said, 'And you will be all right.' And I said, 'I will be all right.' And he said, 'Good.' And that was all. He went to the barn after. I sat at the table for a while. Whatever happens in the next few weeks, I want to have written this down. Whatever happens in the next few weeks. Written on March the 7th, 1920. 20 days before the last photograph. 49 days before Elias disappeared. The second entry is dated March the 8th, 1920. It reads, "He was gone before I was awake this morning," which is not usual. Usually I hear him go, the boards in the hallway, the kitchen door. This morning I was awake before first light, and he was already gone. I went to the bench above the hollow at noon. I did not go further. He was back before supper. He did not say anything about the morning, and I did not ask. He went to the bench but did not go to the shallow. He knew better. He had known better for 64 years, and on the day his brother went further than the bench for a reason Samuel did not ask about, he went to the nearest point he could reach and stopped there, and came home, and did not ask. The third entry is dated March the 12th, 1920. It reads, "I am not going to look for him any more. Not because I am giving up, because there is nothing to look for in the direction I would be looking, and I understand that now, and I trust Elias to have known what he was doing, which he always has, which is one of the constants I have had in 64 years of knowing him, that he knows what he is doing more completely than most people know what they are doing, because he has had more time to come to it, and because what he was carrying was simple enough, in its own strange way, that he was able to know it clearly, the way you can see a single clean line more clearly than you can see a complicated one." The entry ends there. He did not write again for 11 days. The next entry, March the 23rd, is about the fence on the north side of the property, and whether it can hold through another winter without new posts. Elias Fenn was last seen on the morning of April the 26th, 1920. I want to be precise about what that sentence means and what it does not mean. It does not mean that anyone witnessed him leaving. It means that the record, which is Samuel's journal, and the county records, and the account Vera Rooks gave Harold Chafin in the 1961 session, agrees that on the morning of April the 26th, which was not the birthday, which was a full 23 days after the birthday, and after the last photograph was taken, Elias Fenn got up before dawn and went up the path and did not come back. This is the detail that troubled me longest in this case, and that I want to sit with for a moment before I go on. The birthday was April the 3rd. The last photograph was April the 3rd. The conversation Samuel records, the one that begins with Elias saying, "I need you to know that I know what I am doing," was in the first week of March. And then 3 weeks passed. The last photograph was taken, and then 23 more days passed after the photograph. And then Elias went, on April the 26th, which is nobody's birthday. Why the 26th? Samuel does not say in the journal. Granny Rooks does not address it directly in the Chaffin recording, though she does say, at one point in the third session, that the returning to the pool does not have to be on the birthday, only the first going does, only the one that brings the pool to you. After that, she says, the pool knows you, and going back to it on any morning before dawn alone is sufficient, because you are not introducing yourself anymore. You already belong to it. You already belong to it. After the first morning, after April the 3rd of 1886, Elias Fenn belonged to the day pool in a way he did not belong to any time that was moving forward. He could go back on any birthday morning, yes, but he could also go back on any morning before dawn, alone, and the pool would be what it had always been for him since 1886, the thing that had his face. Why the 26th? I have a hypothesis that I will not present as more than a hypothesis, because it is inferential, and I want to be honest about that. I think the birthday was never the required day. I think the birthday was the required day only for the first time, because the birthday is the day the pool can find you, the day it can reach the part of you that is running, the part that is moving through years toward death. And I think that once the pool found Elias, on April the 3rd, 1886, any morning before dawn was the same to it. And I think the reason he waited until the 26th is the same reason he told Samuel what he told him in the first week of March, and the same reason his hand was moving in the last photograph 23 days before he went. He was ready on the 3rd. He had been ready for some time before the 3rd. But there were things he wanted to do first. What those things were, the journal does not say. Samuel does not record any particular events in the 3 weeks after the photograph that would distinguish those weeks from the ones before. They split wood. Samuel went to town for supplies on the 14th. The south fence needed work. It was ordinary. Whatever Elias was doing in those 23 days, he was doing it in the fabric of an ordinary life, and Samuel was allowing him to do it without asking, and both of them were proceeding in the way of people who have made an agreement that will not be spoken about again because it has already been spoken about and there is nothing further to say. Samuel's journal entry for April the 26th, 1920 reads, "He went this morning. I knew it when I did not hear him at 4. Not the boards in the hallway, not the kitchen door, nothing. And I knew from the nothing that this was different from the usual mornings when I hear him go and hear him come back. I went up the mountain at noon. I did not go past the bench. I have been back for an hour. I do not know what I expected to find at the bench, and I did not find it. The sky is clear. It is a good day for this time of year. A good day for this time of year." He had just watched his brother walk up a mountain and not come back, and the last thing he wrote in the journal that day was that the sky was clear and it was a good day, not because he was not feeling what he was feeling, because the sky actually was clear, because the day was actually good, because he was 50 years old and he had been watching this approach for 64 years, and the approach had become the arrival and the sky was clear. He wrote nothing for 3 weeks. When the journal resumes, it is May the 17th, 1920, and the entry is about the planting, and it goes on in the same careful way for the next 27 years. 27 years. Samuel Fenn lived alone in the house at Swanner Fork from the spring of 1920 to the 21st of January, 1948. When he died, at the age of 77, in the same room where his mother had died in 1912 and his father had died in 1901. He died in the house where he had been born, in the bed where his parents had slept, in January of the year he had turned 77. His death is recorded in the Laurel County records as natural causes, which is the county's term for dying in bed in January at the age of 77 without any dramatic medical event. In the 27 years between Elias's disappearance and Samuel's death, the journal continues without significant interruption. Samuel writes about the farm, about the county, about the weather and the neighbors, and the various large and small events of a life in the mountains in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. He writes about hearing the radio for the first time in a neighbor's house in 1924, and about what he thinks of it. He writes about the Depression hitting the county in 1930, and about the specific ways it changed the lives of people he had known for decades. He writes about the Second World War, briefly and with restraint in entries from the early 1940s that are some of the most careful pieces of prose in the entire run of the journal. He does not write about Elias again. Not once. In 27 years of journal entries after April of 1920, Elias is never mentioned by name, and there is no entry that can be read as being about him or about what happened or about the day pool or about any of it. It is as if, on April the 26th of 1920, Samuel Fenn put a period at the end of that part of his life and moved to the next part, and the next part was just his life, alone, on the farm, for 27 years. Except, the last entry in the journal is dated January the 3rd, 1947. It is not the last entry before his death. He died on January the 21st, 18 days later. There may have been entries between January the 3rd and January the 21st that he was not well enough to write, or that he did not feel the need to write. But the January the 3rd entry is the last one in the journal, and it reads, "I hope wherever he went, it was warmer." That is the last sentence of 61 years of journal entries. He was working the farm, he was managing, he was going to town until the late 1930s when the walk became too much, and then he was tending to the immediate business of a farm without the range he'd once had, and then he was dying, slowly and in the ordinary way. In January of 1948, and the last thing he wrote in the journal before he stopped writing was, "I hope, wherever he went, it was warmer." Warmer. As if what concerned him about where Elias went was whether Elias was cold. As if that were the practical question remaining after 61 years. Not what it means, not whether it was right, not what it cost, but whether his brother was warm. He donated the photographs to the Laurel County Historical Society on January the 18th of 1948, 3 days before he died. He carried them to Harlan himself, which at his age and in January would have been a considerable undertaking, and he gave them to the archivist at the Historical Society, a woman named Grace Ledford, and he told her they were 43 photographs of his family over 40 years, and that he thought the Historical Society was a better place for them than the house, and he left them there and went home and died 3 days later. He did not mention the note in the photo box until the photographs were already there. Grace Ledford found the note herself, 2 weeks after Samuel's death, when she was cataloging the donation. The note said, "If you are reading this, you have seen the photographs, and you deserve to know that what you are seeing is true. The journal is in the cedar closet, behind the back wall, and the house is at Swanner's Fork, and I am sorry I could not put them together." She did not find the journal. She went to the house at Swanner Fork in February of 1948, and she found the house empty and beginning its long process of returning to the mountain, which happens quickly in Appalachian winters. And she found the cedar closet, and she found the back wall of it, which did not move when she pushed on it. And she did not know that the back wall was false, and required finding the seam on the left side and pressing at the bottom corner. And the journal stayed behind the false wall for 31 years. Dale Witt was not looking for the journal in 1979. He was working on a road crew that was clearing the overgrown access track to the Swanner Fork property, which by 1979 had stood empty for 31 years and was in the process of being demolished to clear the land for a timber operation. He was not an antiquarian. He was a man with a crowbar who happened to work on the walls of the right room on the right afternoon, and who found a false back wall in a cedar closet, and who pulled it open, and who found a cardboard box that turned out to contain a bound journal spanning 61 years. He took it home because it seemed like something that should not be thrown away, which is the honest account of why he took it, and he kept it for 2 years before a neighbor who had heard about it brought it to the attention of the Laurel County Historical Society, which is where it was when I found it, in the Special Collections Room, in a climate-controlled box, in the fall of 2019. The photograph box had been in the archive for 71 years by the time I saw it. The journal had been there for 39. Grace Ledford was dead. Dale Witt was in his late 70s and living in town, and I spoke to him on the phone in the winter of 2019, and he said he remembered the wall and the box and the journal, and he said he had known from the first page he read that it was something a person should pay attention to, and he said, in the way of a man in his late 70s who has been asked about something he found 40 years earlier, I hope somebody does something with it. And then he said, I read a few pages, and I put it away, and I did not read any more. I have my reasons. He did not say what his reasons were. I did not press him. Now let me tell you about the archive, and what it is like to spend 4 years with this case, and what Patricia Ely said to me, and what happens when you look at the photographs for long enough. Let me tell you what happened to the annual photographs after 1920, because it is easy to assume that they ended there with the last print, and they did not. Samuel Fenn continued to photograph himself every April from 1921 until 1943. 22 more photographs taken on the 3rd of April every year in the yard in front of the house at Swanner Fork. He set the camera on the tripod that had been his father's, and he rigged a cable release, and he stood in the yard alone where both of them had always stood, and he made the photograph. He is on the right side of every one of these photographs. The left side is empty, not empty in the sense of nothing there. The yard is there, the pine tree, the house in the background continuing its long deterioration. Empty in the sense of nobody standing there. Elias's side of the frame, the side where the weight was on the left leg, where the right foot turned slightly inward, where the left hand had its slight upward curl. Empty of all of that. I looked at the 22 solo photographs on my 4th visit to the archive in the summer of 2020, on the day I asked Patricia Ely what she had meant by her initial warning. She had not included them in the box with the original 43. They were in a separate folder, in the flat file below the box, and she told me they were there when I asked whether there were any other photographs in the collection related to the Fenn family. There are 22 of them. 22 years of April, the 3rd photographs, Samuel alone in the yard, on the right side of the frame, with the left side empty. I looked at them in sequence, as I had looked at the original 43. And I want to tell you what the experience of looking at those 22 photographs is like, coming immediately after the experience of looking at the 43, because it is a very specific experience, and it matters. What you notice first is the absence. Samuel is there, aging year by year in the right side of the frame, and the left side of the frame is simply the yard. After 40 years of looking at a frame in which there are always 2 people, the absence of the second person in the same space is jarring in a way that a person who had not seen the original 43 would not feel. It is not simply that there is more space in the frame, it is that there is a wrong amount of space. A space where a person was and no longer is. What you notice second is Samuel's posture. In the original 43 photographs, Samuel stood squarely, weight even, feet parallel. In every one of the 22 solo photographs, he is standing in the same posture, but very slightly further left than he would have stood in the original series, not dramatically further, perhaps a foot, as if he is, unconsciously, without deciding to, filling some small part of the empty space on the left side of the frame, not filling it because one person cannot fill the space of 2, but leaning toward it, orienting slightly toward it. He did this every year for 22 years. I do not know whether he knew he was doing it. The last of the solo photographs is from 1943, April the 3rd. Samuel is 73 years old. He looks older than 73. The face has the exhaustion of a man who has been farming alone for 23 years, past the age when a man should be farming alone, whose body has been paying the compound interest of hard physical work for decades, who is still doing it because the farm requires it and because he is the kind of man who does what the farm requires. The house in the background is in visible disrepair, missing boards on the porch, a section of the addition's roof that has begun to sag, windows that have lost their paint so thoroughly that the wood is beginning to gray and check. He is standing on the right side of the frame. The left side is empty. He is looking at the camera in the way he has always looked at it, with the patient, controlled expression of a man complying with a ritual he has agreed to maintain. He made no photograph in 1944, or 45, or 46, or 47. He was 83 years old in 1947, and something about his condition, the records do not say what exactly, had made the outdoor walk to the tripod and the cable release no longer manageable. He died in January of 48. The last photograph he made of himself in the yard was in April of 43, when he was 73 years old. The 20-second solo photograph is the last image in the entire Fenn photographic record. It shows one man, 73 years old, standing in a yard in front of a deteriorating house on a mountain bench in southeastern Tennessee on the 3rd of April, 1943. He is standing on the right side of the frame. The left side of the frame is the yard and the pine tree and the face of Pine Mountain through the trees and the afternoon light coming in from the west that his father had spent 34 years trying to photograph correctly. That is the end of the photographic record. And I want to say something about the note Samuel Fenn left in the photo box, because the note is, like everything else Samuel Fenn produced in his life, short and precise and carrying a lot more than it says on the surface. The note reads, "If you are reading this, you have seen the photographs, and you deserve to know that what you are seeing is true. The journal is in the cedar closet behind the back wall, and the house is at Swanner's Fork, and I am sorry I could not put them together." He says, "You deserve to know that what you are seeing is true." He does not say, "I am going to explain it to you." He does not say, "I am going to tell you what to think about it." He says, "It is true. What you saw is accurate." He is not asking you to explain it, or to find an explanation for it, or to put it into a framework that makes it comfortable. He is only asking you to know that it is true. He says, "I am sorry I could not put them together." He could not put the photographs and the journal in the same place, the same box, the same delivery. He donated the photographs to the Historical Society and hid the journal behind a false wall in a house that he expected, correctly, would eventually be demolished, and he knew when he did it that the photographs might be found without the journal, or the journal without the photographs, or neither in the right order, and he was sorry for the difficulty that caused. Not sorry in a self-flagellating way. In the way of a man who has planned something carefully and knows the plan has a weakness in it that he cannot fix. He planned for this discovery. He planned for the photographs and the journal and the note to eventually be assembled by someone who would approach them the way a researcher approaches evidence, and he provided what he could provide toward that assembly: a note in the box, a clue in the note, a journal behind a false wall with 61 years of the plainest honest account he could produce. He did everything he could, within the limits of what was possible for a man in his situation, to make the truth available without saying it in a way that would have required him to say it to people who were not ready to hear it. He was a careful man. He was, in his quiet, careful way, a very brave one. I have spent 4 years with this case, and I have thought a great deal about what it means to spend 4 years with something that does not fit inside the frameworks that most of us use to understand what is true and what is not. About what it does to a researcher to spend 4 years with evidence that points somewhere most frameworks for thinking cannot comfortably go. And I want to say something about that here, honestly, in the way that I have tried to be honest about every other element of this case. It changes you. Not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, not in a way that makes it hard to do other work or live an ordinary life. In a quieter way, the kind of change that you notice at the edges of things when you are walking somewhere and you pass a face that is a specific age and you find yourself thinking, what would it mean if that face were the same tomorrow? What would it mean if the face were always that age, exactly that age, not close to it or approximately it, but exactly it, for years, for decades, for a lifetime, while the person inside it continued? What would it mean to be the inside of a face that was not going anywhere, to be the part that aged while the record of aging did not, To be, for 64 years, on the other side of something, I do not know what it would mean. I have been thinking about it for 4 years, and I do not know. But I have a clearer sense of the question now than I did when I started, and I think that is something. I think being able to hold the question clearly, without reaching for an answer that makes it comfortable, is the most honest thing I can do with what Samuel Fenn gave us. He gave us 61 years of a careful man's attention to an uncanny thing. He gave us the photographs, 43 of them, unmanipulated, showing what they show year after year without apology or explanation. He gave us the note in the box. He gave us the clue to the journal. He did not give us a resolution, because there is no resolution that is available in the normal sense of the word. And he knew that, and I think he respected his eventual reader enough not to pretend otherwise. The resolution is the photographs. The resolution is what they show. The resolution is 43 images, and then 22 more, and then silence, and the empty left side of the frame, where the weight was always on the left leg, where the right foot turned slightly inward, where the left hand had its slight upward curl. The resolution is that Elias went up the path, and the photographs stayed. And I have been, on my more honest days, grateful to Samuel Fenn for the note in the box, for the sorry I could not put them together, for the I hope wherever he went it was warmer, for the plainness of all of it, the complete absence of drama in a life that contained more uncanny material than most people encounter in a lifetime, and the way he managed that uncanny material with the same undemonstrative competence he brought to the north fence and the planting and the feed store and everything else that needed managing. He knew that the most honest thing he could do was manage it well and leave the record and trust the eventually found evidence to speak. He was right. The evidence speaks. It is worth pausing here before I take you into the archive to address the question that the evidence raises about what it is to live inside the uncanny for 60 years as a known and functioning member of a community. Because that is what Samuel Fenn did. He was not a recluse, hiding the strangeness of his situation in a house that no one visited. He was known in Harlan County. He went to church in the county seat into his late 60s, when the walk became too much. He shopped at Lyle's store and was mentioned in other people's letters and diaries as a steady and decent presence. He served for a period in the late 1920s on the county school board. He is described in the account of a woman named Bessie Combs, who grew up in the county and who wrote a memoir of her Laurel County childhood in the 1980s as the quietest man she had ever met and the one whose quietness felt most like a full room rather than an empty one. A full room. Bessie Combs did not know about the photographs or the journal. She knew Samuel Fenn as a neighbor and as a fixture of the county, and as someone whose manner she remembered with affection and whose quietness she found memorable enough to describe 50 years later in terms of that particular fullness. She was describing, without knowing it, the quality that Harlan Fenn had named as the most valuable thing in a portrait subject. The interior stillness, the quality of having gone somewhere quiet inside oneself. Samuel had it too. Both brothers had it, from different causes, in different forms. Elias had it because the day pool had taken the running part, and what was left was the stillness of the moment of arrival. Samuel had it because he had been carrying something for 60 years, and had learned, through 60 years of practice, how to carry it without letting it leak into his face. Two kinds of stillness, one that was taken and one that was learned. I have thought, more than once in 4 years, about whether the 60-year habit of maintaining that controlled front, of presenting an ordinary face to a county that could not have understood what was behind it, shaped Samuel Fenn into something closer to his brother than either of them intended. Not the frozen face, not the 16-year-old features. Samuel aged in the ordinary way, year by year. The photographs show it plainly. But some of the interior quality, the stillness of a person who has spent so long carrying something that the carrying is no longer visible. I do not know whether this is true. It is the kind of inference that the evidence does not confirm or deny, only suggests. But it seems to me that 60 years of living with the uncanny without breaking, managing a farm and attending church, and being remembered as a decent presence, would still produce a quality of stillness that is not the same as nothing at all. Samuel Fenn was not nothing. He was the kind of person who, at the age of 76, writes his last journal entry and reaches for warmth as the thing to hope for his brother. Not understanding, not peace in any formal spiritual sense. Warmth, the simple physical comfort of a body that is no longer cold. He was a farmer. He knew that cold was real, and that warmth was better, and that the most honest thing you could wish for someone was the simplest good thing, and the simplest good thing was warmth. I find, at the end of 4 years with this case, that I agree with him. Now let me tell you about another element of the case that I have not yet fully addressed, which is what happened to Elias's presence in the years after the annual photographs began to diverge in the counties outside Laurel, and what the documentary record shows about how the situation was or was not perceived by the world beyond the farm and the county. The answer is almost nothing. There are very few records of Elias Fenn in any documentary source outside the family papers after 1886. He is listed in the census records of 1890 and 1900 and 1910 as a resident of the household at Swanner Fork, occupation farmer. He is not listed in the 1920 census, which is consistent with disappearing in April of that year before the enumeration. He appears in 2 church membership rolls, one from the 1890s and one from the early 1900s, as a member of the same church the family attended in Harlan. He signed, as a witness, a document related to a property transaction involving the Vestal family in 1903, and his signature is in the record. That signature, I want to tell you about that signature. The property document is in the Laurel County Register of Deeds, and I obtained a copy of it in the spring of 2020, and I looked at it for a long time before I processed what I was looking at. The signature is in the left-leaning script of a left-handed person. It is a careful signature, not a rushed one, the kind that a person writes when they know the document will be a formal record and want to sign it well. The year is 1903. Elias Fenn was 33 years old. And the signature is the signature of a person who is 33 years old, not in its content, which is only a name, but in its quality, the kind of confidence in the pen that comes from 33 years of signing things, the slight assurance of the downstroke, the way the loops have settled into their adult form, a 33-year-old's hand in a 33-year-old's signature, which means that whatever the pool did to his face, it did not do it to his hand. His handwriting aged. He signed documents in the way a 33-year-old signs documents, not in the way a 16-year-old does. The hand was not frozen. The hand aged in the ordinary way, developing the ordinary confidence and settledness of a hand that has been writing for 33 years. I do not know what to make of that, except to say that it is consistent with what Vera Rooks described. The pool takes the running part from the face. The face is what the pool keeps. The rest of the person, including apparently the hand and the handwriting and the interior that goes on aging and accumulating experience, continues. The pool keeps the face. The rest of the person keeps going. And the signature of a 33-year-old man in a property document in 1903 is evidence, small and specific and easy to miss, that the rest of the person had continued in the ordinary way. The hand that wrote it was the hand of a man who had been writing for 33 years, not for 16. He had been alive for 33 years. He had signed his name approximately 33 years' worth of times before he signed that document, and the signature shows it. I think about that signature when I think about what it means to say that Elias Fenn's face was frozen at 16. It is easy, in the ordinary language of such things, to say frozen and mean somehow not alive, but the signature is not frozen. The signature is the opposite of frozen. The signature is exactly as aged as a 33-year-old signature should be, because the hand that made it had been making signatures for 33 years, and 33 years had accumulated in it in the ordinary way, the way they accumulate in a hand. Incrementally, without drama, 1 year after another, until the hand is the kind of hand that has been signing things for 33 years. He was alive. He had been alive for all of it. The pool took the face and kept it. The rest of him went on. This is the thing I have to hold against the photographs, against the stillness of Elias's face in the photographs from 1891 onward, against the quality of his looking that I have been calling the interior kind. He was not static. He was not paused. He was a man alive in his years, carrying his years in the way any person carries years, and the face that was the record of those years had been kept at the moment the pool found it, and so the record of the years was not visible in the face, but the years were happening behind it. The stillness was not the stillness of not moving. It was the stillness of moving through something that does not show on the surface. That is a different kind of stillness than I initially understood when I began this case. It took me 2 years to understand the difference, and I think the difference is important because it changes what it means that Harlan Fenn found that quality in Elias's face and could not produce it in his other portrait subjects, except occasionally, briefly, in the long work of a session. He was finding something real. He was finding, in the face of his son, the actual quality of a person who was moving through something that does not show on the surface and had been doing it since 1886 and would go on doing it for 34 more years. He was photographing the real thing every April for the rest of his life, and filing it in a locked drawer, and carrying whatever he understood or almost understood about it, and dying without saying. There is one more element of the case I have not addressed directly, which is the spring itself. The spring that feeds the shallow from underground, that keeps the water cold even in August, that Vera Rooks described in the Chafin recording as a spring that goes underground before it reaches the bench. That spring is still there. Or rather, the geologic structures that produce it are still there because limestone aquifers of the kind common in that portion of the Cumberland Plateau do not disappear on a human timescale. Whether the shallow as Elias Fenn and Vera Rooks knew it still exists in the form they knew, it is a different question, one I cannot answer with certainty because I have not gone past the bench. What I can tell you is that the limestone bench above Swanner Fork is still accessible and that the path from the Swanner Fork Hollow runs roughly where it ran in 1886, modified by a century of timber operations and the overgrowth that follows them. I walked it twice, on the visits I have mentioned, and on both occasions I found the bench in good condition, the limestone exposed in the same general pattern the old photographs of the ridge show when the leaves are down. The hollow on the east side drops away from the bench in the way Samuel Disjournal describes. The left fork of the path is still navigable, or was when I was last there, though it is harder going than the main path. I went to the edge of the bench. I looked into the hollow. The light in the late afternoon, in October, does the thing that Harlan Fenn wrote about in his letter to his brother in August of 1867. It comes through the gap in the western ridge and falls on the face of the mountain, in that color between copper and the inside of a chestnut shell, with the quality of depth he described as going into the rock rather than simply illuminating it. I stood at the edge of the bench in that light for about 20 minutes, and I did not feel anything that I would call a draw, and I went home. But I thought about the water, cold even in August, the rings going out and coming back, the pool keeping what it keeps, in the dark below the bench, in the quiet of the hollow that has no name I know. I thought about the first morning, April the 3rd, 1886, a boy of 16 walking up through the pasture in the dark before the light came over the ridge, following something he could feel without yet knowing its name, finding the path fork and taking the left one over the low ridge and down into the second hollow, arriving at the edge of the shallow in the dark, in the cold that even August cannot touch. The water not moving, the stillness of it. The moment before he knelt, or reached, or simply stood at the edge long enough for the pool to find what the pool was looking for in him. The moment of arrival. That precise 16-year-old moment. And then, from that moment forward, carrying it. Carrying the stillness of it in his face for 64 years, through every April photograph, through all the ordinary years of the farm and the county and the walks before dawn, in the dark that was easier for him now. Carrying it to the camera and looking back through it, directly, with the interior kind of stillness, year after year, until the year he went back and did not come back. And the photograph stayed, and the morning went quiet on the bench above the Swanner Fork Hollow, and that was all. Patricia Ely has worked at the Laurel County Historical Society for 19 years. She has the quality of a good archivist, which is a specific kind of intelligence, precise, organized, deeply patient with detail, and possessed of the kind of calm that comes from spending your professional life with things that are old, things that have already survived everything that was going to happen to them and are now simply waiting to be correctly understood. She is not a credulous person. She is not the kind of person who invites things to be more mysterious than they are. She is, in fact, the kind of person who is constitutionally resistant to that kind of inflation, who has a professional obligation to the accurate preservation and description of primary sources, and who understands that inflation is a form of inaccuracy. So when Patricia Ely said to me, on the morning of my first visit to the archive in September of 2019, that I should be aware that other researchers had found it difficult to spend extended time alone with the Fenn photographs, and that I should let her know if I needed to step out, I listened. Not because I was immediately convinced of anything, because Patricia Ely was the kind of person who would not say something like that unless she had a concrete reason to say it, and I wanted to know what the concrete reason was. I did not ask her directly that first day. I was too interested in the photographs to ask. I spent 3 hours with the photo box on my first visit, going through the 43 prints in sequence, and I came back the next day and spent 4 more hours, and I came back the day after that, and by the end of the third day, I had filled a notebook with observations, and I had looked at every photograph multiple times, and I had not, as far as I could tell, needed to step out. I went back to the archive in November of 2019, and then again in February of 2020, and then the pandemic arrived and I could not go back until the fall of 2020, and the 4 months of not going back were, in retrospect, the time in which I should have asked Patricia Ely what she meant. Because here is what I had noticed by the fall of 2020, and what I am going to try to describe as accurately as I can, which means describing it without inflation, without drama, in the precise terms of what I actually experienced, because that is the only form of honesty I have available. I had noticed that I was thinking about the photographs in a particular way when I was not looking at them. Not that I was thinking about the case, which I would expect, because 4 years into a research project, the case is always in the background of your thinking. Not that I was thinking about the details of the photographs, which I would also expect, because you hold the specific details of primary sources in order to work with them when you are not in the archive. I was thinking about the photographs themselves, about what it felt like to be looked at by the photographs, which is not a phrase that would have occurred to me as accurate before 2020, but that is the phrase that eventually became accurate, because looking at a photograph and being looked at by a photograph turn out to be the same experience in certain conditions, and the conditions in the Laurel County Archive reading room, after enough visits, were those conditions. I want to be specific about what I mean. When you look at a portrait photograph, you are looking at a record of a moment of looking, the moment the photographer and subject established whatever relation it was that produced the image. With most portrait photographs, the looking is directional. You look at them, and the subject in the photograph looks at whatever they were looking at when the photograph was taken, which may or may not be the camera. And the looking is yours and not returned. The subject does not look back. The subject is not present to look back. In the Fenn photographs from 1891 onward, specifically in the photographs where Elias is looking directly into the lens, there is something that does not feel like looking at a record of a moment of looking. There is something that feels like looking at a person who is looking back. And I want to be very clear that I am describing a felt experience, not a claim about the ontological status of a photographic print. I am not saying the print is alive. I am saying that the experience of being in the room with those prints, looking at the face of Elias Fenn in the photographs from 1891 onward, has a quality that the experience of looking at most portrait photographs does not have. Patricia Ely was right. I should have been prepared for it. I asked her, on my 6th visit to the archive in the fall of 2020, what she had meant by her initial warning. She said, in the careful way she says things, "People who spend a lot of time with those particular photographs sometimes find that the photographs are doing something back." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And she said, "I mean that the photographs are not passive in the way that most photographs are passive, and that when you notice they are not passive, it can be disorienting, and I wanted you to know that was possible before you spent too much time in here alone. Not passive." She said it in a different way than Regan Muir, who said the photographs were not behaving the way you would expect a collection of photographs to behave. She said it in a different way than Vera Rooks, who said the pool keeps what it wants. But all three of them were describing, from their different positions and with their different vocabularies, the same thing. Something in those photographs is oriented outward. I want to be careful here. I want to be very careful here, because what I am going to say next is what I believe, and I want you to understand that I hold my belief with appropriate uncertainty, that I am a careful researcher who has spent 4 years with primary sources and who is not in the business of claiming more than the evidence supports. I am also a person who has spent 4 years sitting in a room in the mountains of Tennessee, looking at a face that does not change, and that experience has done something to the way I think about evidence. Here is what I believe. I believe that on April the 3rd, 1886, at some point between 2 and 4 in the morning, Elias Fenn walked up the path from the house at Swanner Fork, through the pasture and into the trees, past the spring-fed pool where the water was cold even in August, past the stone foundation whose origin no one could say, to the fork in the path, and took the left fork over the low ridge, and down into the second hollow on the east side, and found the shallow in the dark, before the light came over the ridge. I believe he went alone, as the rule required. I believe the shallow took from him the part that was moving through years toward death. I believe it kept that part. I believe his face stayed at the moment it was found, which was 16, and that the rest of him continued in every way that matters. He thought and felt and aged inside, and he worked the farm, and he looked directly into his father's camera every April for 34 more years. And he bit his left thumbnail when he was thinking about something, and he walked before dawn in the dark that was easier for him than it was for everyone else. And he was kind and quiet and present in every ordinary way, and his mother called him "my heart," the way she always had, and his brother wrote about him in a journal for 61 years. I believe that what Vera Rooks saw in his face when she looked at him across the yard in the 1930s was accurate, that what was looking back was not a 16-year-old boy's knowledge inside an old man's knowledge inside a boy's face, but something that had been on the other side of what the pool does and had come back from it carrying that crossing, and that carrying a crossing like that changes a person's relation to being looked at in a way that persists in photographs. I believe that on April the 26th, 1920, he went back. I believe he went back on the 26th rather than the 3rd, because he had something to do between the 3rd and the 26th, and that what he had to do, those 23 days, was be present in the life he had been living for 34 years, in a way that honored it, and then let go of it, and then go. I do not believe he died. I believe the pool finished what it started. I believe it took the rest. And I do not know, and I am committed to not knowing, what taking the rest means for the person it was taken from, because I believe that Vera Rooks was right that dying and what the pool does are not the same thing, and I am suspicious of explanations that conflate them, because they are explanations that make the thing more familiar and therefore less true than it actually is. What I know for certain is this: the photographs exist. I have held them. Regan Muir has examined them, and she is 18 years at a major museum, and she has no explanation for what she sees in them. Samuel Fenn's journal exists. I have read all 61 years of it, and nothing in it is performed. It is the record of a man managing something real, in the flat, honest voice of someone who knows that honesty is the only form of respect the thing deserves. Clara's letter exists. The Chaffin recordings exist, and I have heard them. The census records and death certificates and studio accounts and family papers exist, and I have read them. The photo box note exists, and I have read it. The account book entry exists, in Clara's own handwriting, 2 weeks before she died, to his walk this morning. These are the facts. The facts point in a direction that most frameworks for thinking about the world cannot comfortably contain, and I have stopped asking those frameworks to contain it, because I have found that asking them to do that produces worse thinking rather than better, and I am committed to good thinking about this case, even at the cost of comfortable thinking. There is a question I have been asked, by people who have heard me talk about this case, that I want to address here, at the end, because it is the right question, and it deserves a real answer rather than a deflection. The question is, have you been to the shallow? No. I have been to the bench above Swanner Fork. I have stood at the edge of the limestone bench and looked into the second hollow on the east side, where the path forks left and goes down into the trees. I have been there twice. Once in the fall of 2019 on a clear October afternoon, and once in the early spring of 2021 on a morning that was cold even for April, with a frost still on the grass on the bench. I did not go further, not because I was afraid, not because I felt something specific that stopped me. I did not go further because I went to the bench deliberately, both times with the intention of standing at the edge and not going further, because I think that is the honest researcher's position in relation to this case. I have the evidence. I have the primary sources. I have the testimony and the photographs and the journal and the recordings. I do not need to go further. And I thought both times about the pull that Vera Rooks described, the pull she felt on the morning of her birthday in the years when the draw came to her, and I was glad, on the bench in October and again in April, that the draw did not appear to work in the direction of a researcher going over a ridge on a weekday afternoon who had not been born on that mountain and had not been born into the knowledge that the mountain carried. I thought, both times, about Elias Fenn standing at the edge of his own bench on some equivalent morning, in some equivalent dark, before 1886, deciding whether to go. And I thought about Samuel, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Both of them on the same side of the decision for 16 years, and then one of them going, and the other one not, and 43 photographs to account for what that meant. There is a detail from the Chaffin recording that I have not given you yet, and that I want to give you now, at the end, because it is the one I think about most. It is from the July 22nd session, near the beginning, when Harold Chaffin asks Granny Rooks why the pool is called the day pool, what the word day has to do with it, and she gives him an answer that he transcribes and then circles in his field notes and writes alongside the circle in his own hand, "This is the one." She said, "We call it the day pool because what it keeps is the day, the moment of a day, not a day in the sense of 24 hours, in the sense of a particular moment in a particular day that was the moment a person came into the running. Every person has a moment like that, not just the day they were born, but the exact moment, the moment they start moving through time toward its end. And the pool can find that moment in a person if they come to it on the right day, alone, in the dark, before the light. And when it finds it, it holds it. That is the only word I know for it. It holds the moment, and the moment does not move anymore. And the face that was in that moment does not move anymore. And the person who had that moment lives on around it, inside it, the way you live inside a house, the way the house stands still and you move through it. The house does not move with you. The moment does not move with them. And the person carries that stillness in their face, the stillness of the moment the pool found, which is the stillness of the moment you arrived. The stillness of the moment you arrived. I have read that sentence in Chaffin's transcription of Vera Rooks's words many times over 4 years, and each time I read it, I think about Harlan Fenn, about the thing he spent his entire working life looking for in his portrait subjects. The interior stillness, the quality of having gone somewhere quiet inside oneself, settled down into oneself the way water settles when you stop disturbing it. He spent 34 years trying to produce that quality in his subjects for the camera and succeeding only sometimes briefly in the long, complex work of a portrait session. His son had it from 1891 onward, every April, without trying, looking directly into the camera with the stillness his father had named as the most valuable thing he knew how to find in a face. Harlan Fenn, who could feel that something was wrong with the photographs but could not say what, who filed them in a locked drawer for 14 years, who never said out loud what he could see, who died in January of 1901 without understanding. And in every photograph from 1891 onward, his son is looking back at him through the lens with the quality he had spent his life seeking. The stillness of the moment you arrived. Not moving toward anything, just arrived and staying arrived and looking back at whoever came with the camera. I have not been able to look at the series in the same order since I read that sentence. I now start with the 1920 photograph, the last one, with the motion blur in Elias's left hand. I look at it for a while, and then I go back to the 1880 photograph, the first one, the two boys in their uncomfortable shoes in the summer of their 10th year, and I go forward through them, slowly, knowing what is coming and watching it approach, and by the time I reach the 1891 photograph, the first one where Elias looks directly into the lens, I always stop for a long time, because there is something in that photograph that I think is the clearest record of what this case is about, clearer than any of the documents or the testimony or the 43 image series taken as a whole. A face that has arrived at 16 and stopped arriving anywhere further, looking directly back at whoever is looking, not asking for anything, not performing anything, simply present, in the stillness of the moment the pool found, with the quality of someone who has been holding a particular attention for a long time, and who will go on holding it for as long as there is a camera to hold it for. He went up the path. He did not come back. The photograph stays. I want to close by telling you two small things that I keep returning to that do not fit neatly into the account I have been building, but that are too true to leave out. The first, Samuel Fenn's final journal entry, January the 3rd, 1947. I hope, wherever he went, it was warmer. He was 76 years old, and he had been living in the house at Swanner Fork alone for 27 years, and the thing he wanted for his brother was warmth, not understanding, not proof of any claim. Warmth. Samuel Fenn, who spent 61 years writing carefully about the thing he was living with, chose warmth as his last word on the subject, because it is the kind of thing you hope for someone you love, and because he loved his brother in the plain continuing way that a person loves the one they shared a womb with, and a room with, and a life with, even when the life was what it was. The second, the account book entry. May of 1912. To his walk this morning. Clara Fenn dying, not going to the window. And then, not knowing any more what she would see if she went. She had been watching that face since it was newborn. She had been calling them both my heart since they were infants. And in the last weeks of her life, she made the same choice Samuel made. She heard him go, and she did not look. I have spent 4 years with that image, Clara Fenn, at the window she did not open, in the dark of 4 in the morning, in a house in the mountains of Tennessee, and I do not know whether what she would have seen, if she had looked, was what she was afraid of, or something she had no framework for at all. I do not know whether what she chose not to see was her son going up the path in the way he had always gone, or something else, something that was true of him and of the dark, in those hours that required not going to the window to remain deniable. I hope she knew, at the end, that he was still there, that the thing she was not looking at was her son going up the mountain in the dark, walking in the hours that were easier for him now, in the direction of the place that had his face, my heart. He was still there. He went up the path, and the water kept what it kept, and he came home, and he went up again every year, and came home, and he went up one last time, and did not come home, and the photographs stayed, all 43 of them, in the box, in the archive, in the reading room where I have been sitting for 4 years, in the buzzing overhead light, trying to say exactly what I have seen. This is what I have seen. The case is called "The Fenn Twins Were Photographed Every Year from 1880. One of them stopped changing in 1886. The photographs are in the Laurel County Historical Society archive, in a flat file box in the Special Collections Room. And if you go there and ask for them, Patricia Ely will bring them to you on a padded tray, and she will tell you before she leaves the room that you should let her know if you need to step out. Listen to her, and wherever he went, I also hope